Hello, and thank you for choosing this clean historical Western romance from Indiana Wake. Before we begin, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Your support helps us keep sharing more wonderful stories for free. Now, settle in and journey back to the Old West, where love, courage, and second chances are waiting to be found. Copyright Indiana Wake. Finding His Way by Indiana Wake Chapter 1. So, it looks like you'll need to take both wagons this week. We sure are running low. Elsie Marshall was smiling at the 4 ranch hands. It will be 2 of you in each wagon. You have a safe journey. Sure will, Elsie, Peter said and grinned. I got enough food here to choke a horse. Eat it on the way back, or you'll be too full-bellied to load up. Elsie looked at her favorite ranch hand and laughed. Don't worry, I'll keep an eye on him, said Ted from the second wagon. Joel smiled from his seat but stayed silent. In the years he'd worked on his family's ranch, he'd always enjoyed the playfully antagonistic banter between his sister and Peter. Most mornings began with a little fooling between the two of them, and it seemed to set them all up for a good day. He admired Elsie. She adored the ranch and still went out every morning and certainly did her bit throughout the day. All while managing to keep a loving eye on her 2 children. They were only 3 and 4 years old and often to be seen with their ma or pa wandering about the ranch looking at the cattle or helping to keep things tidy. All in all, the now huge Wild Meadow Ranch was still a family affair, given that the 16 employed ranch hands had all been made to feel a part of things. The pay was more than fair, and everybody's opinion counted for something. It was a place Joel had hankered to be ever since he was in the schoolroom. He'd badgered his mother every day for years to be freed from what he saw as the confines of his education, though he never admitted that he'd truly enjoyed every minute of school. And his badgering got him nowhere, for Charlotte Martin had ensured her son had stayed in school until he was just turned 15. After that, he'd become the ranch hand he'd always dreamed of being. So why, 4 years later, did he not feel he was in the right place after all? His own task that morning was checking on supplies in the stores at the top end of the ranch. He would tidy them up ready for the new feed, timber, and fixings, which would come in from up north when the guys got back from the weekly supply run. There was no denying that the material needs of the ranch were growing with its success, and Joel knew that his sisters had played such a large part in that. Still, he was glad to have the morning to himself and something to occupy his thoughts. Joel wanted to do anything that would chase away the doubts he had been secretly feeling for so long. He knew he was restless, he just didn't know why and certainly didn't know what to do about it. How's it going? Joel had been so engrossed in his task that when Garth came over to check on him some 2 hours later, his stepfather's sudden appearance surprised him. Same as ever, Joel said and smiled. Joel had a fair recollection of his own father, Cal Meadows, who had died just about 9 years before. But Garth had been his father for almost as long as his own father had, and he loved and admired him in the same way he had loved and admired Cal. The only thing they had ever butted heads over was school. There again, Joel had butted heads with just about everybody on that matter. He knew, as everybody else did, that it had just become a habit more than anything else. Joel had never told anybody that he missed his old school days in the beginning, but he was certain that they all knew it. They were a close family, held together at times by adversity, as well as flourishing in the good times. Just as any good family would do. And, just as they had all silently understood that Joel really liked school, he was certain that they all now silently understood that he was restless for some reason. We're doing better than ever, Joel. It's been a real team effort, right enough, and that's probably what has pulled us through the worst of times, Garth said, and Joel was already wondering where this conversation was heading. I reckon it's been a long time since the worst of things was the way of things around here, Joel said and lifted another sack of feed into position. He almost had the feed stores put to rights, and he wished that things were just a little more disorderly now. For it would have given him something to continue to do as this conversation rolled on. You know, son, if there's something bothering you, you can say it. You know that, right? Garth lifted the last of the sacks of seed and handed it to his stepson. I know, Garth, he said and smiled. I just get the feeling lately that you are not exactly happy, Garth went on, and Joel felt his flimsy defenses come crashing down. He knew that Garth thought of him as a son, and it always gave him such a wonderful feeling of security. Garth wanted the best for him, whatever that was, and Joel knew it. Maybe it was time to start being honest. The truth is that I've been feeling a little bit out of place. It's nothing anybody else has done, Garth, and I love the ranch. I love Wild Meadow. I just feel that, I don't know, maybe this isn't the place for me after all. It sounds stupid, I know. Especially, given that I spent most of my school days trying to get here. He gave a small self-deprecating laugh. You feel how you feel, Joel, there's nothing stupid about that. Is there something else you want to be doing, here on the ranch? Maybe more responsibility or less responsibility? If there's something I can do to change the way you're feeling, you just say it. You're every bit a part of this place as all of us. I know that, and this really is going to sound insane. I think I was so desperate to be here, all those years ago when I was at school, well, because there was a challenge. There was adversity, and Jane and Elsie were out here dealing with it, doing their bit for the Meadows family. I guess I just wanted to be a part of that, and it made me a kind of frustrated child, you know? He spoke slowly and cautiously, wondering exactly what Garth would think of such a thing. Nobody had enjoyed the family struggle, and certainly, Joel hadn't, but he had wanted to be the warrior that his sisters had both been. Fighting for the family, he always felt his tender age had denied him, quite reasonably, that right. I know it did, Garth said and laughed good-naturedly. I never knew any child who tried to get out of school as much as you did. But I knew then why it was, and I knew it wasn't anything to do with not liking school. I guess I feel like I missed out on helping Wild Meadow go from strength to strength. You've been here for years, and we've continued to go from strength to strength. You've played a real part in that. I know, but there's Tex and Elsie, they sure have done a great job here, just like you always have. You've done a great job here too, Garth said so genuinely that Joel knew he wasn't humoring him. It's easy to do a great job in a place that's already doing well and running smoothly. Sounds to me like you need a challenge, Garth said, and Joel felt a great sense of relief. A challenge of your own to sink your teeth into. Garth had listened to him and understood him. He was not trying to persuade him otherwise, just seeing things from Joel's point of view. In terms of family, Joel Meadows knew he sure did have a lot to be grateful for. I guess I do. I just don't have the first idea of what that challenge could be. I don't know, maybe it means me looking for something else outside of this place. Outside of Grafton Crest? No, just outside of the ranch. Grafton Crest is my home, and I love this town. I don't know, maybe I'll give it a little time and see how I feel a little bit further down the road. You don't have to stay here to please us, Joel. This is your life, son, and you get to choose what you make of it. You know we'll always be right behind you, no matter what you choose, no matter where you go. If you need to talk, you just come to me, all right? Sure thing, Joel said and patted his stepfather on the shoulder in a comradely fashion. Then, I guess I'll leave you to the stores, Garth said, climbed back up onto his horse, smiling at Joel before he turned to go. "Thanks, Garth." "Really?" Joel said, watching his stepfather wander away. When Garth was out of sight, Joel sighed loudly and sat down on one of the sacks of seed. There was some relief in having given voice to the doubts he'd been suffering for so long. But with that relief came the next problem. What on earth did he want to do in this life? Chapter 2. "I haven't really thought about that type of thing yet, Daddy," Rose Clayton said, blushing as she felt all eyes on her around the dinner table. "Well, you're 19 now. Your sister was already married a year by then," Dale Clayton said in the slow, quiet voice that characterized his disappointment in his youngest child. "Daddy, she was never going to find a man as quickly as I did," Louisa Clayton began. "I mean, she's not going to have her pick, is she?" Louisa gave her younger sister a self-satisfied smile across the dinner table. As she stared wordlessly back at Louisa, Rose knew that there was no hope of any support from that quarter. Louisa might sit there smugly brandishing her own marriage like a weapon, but Rose was sharp enough to realize that her sister was far from happy. Louisa had married the son of the head of the Grafton Crest Bank, a most fortuitous union as far as their father had been concerned. Louisa had, predictably, reveled in all the preparations, not to mention her one big day when all eyes were on her in all her perfection. Rose was also smart enough to realize that there was a certain kind of perfection that she herself could do without. She didn't want the attention, the beautiful dress, and all the trimmings. If she was to marry, it was going to be for love and nothing else. But where was she going to find anyone who would love her? Certainly not in Grafton Crest, where her family was feared and despised in equal measure. "You'd be a fine catch for anybody, Rose, if you put a little effort in," Dale said, smiling at her as if there was a compliment hiding somewhere in his words. Fortunately, her brothers had decided to remain silent. Oscar, the oldest of the Clayton brood at almost 30, had never paid his youngest sister much attention at all, save for to bully her on occasion. Gerald, a little younger than Louisa at just 24, was more determined in his bullying. Closer to Rose in age, Gerald had made it his mission to always point out that she was not like the rest of the family. If only he'd known that, to Rose Clayton, such a comment was far from an insult. She had no desire to be anything like the rest of her family. "A lot of effort, Daddy," Louisa said and let out a high-pitched giggle. Now, Louisa," Dale said, chastising his oldest daughter while simultaneously smiling at her indulgently. Oh yes, Louisa was most certainly her father's daughter and far ahead in the field of his favorites. But even that was not something Rose coveted. She had always been able to see just what an effect her father had had on the town of Grafton Crest ever since the family moved there from New York. She had always known that he was ruthless when it came to others, not caring a thing for their livelihoods, their hopes and dreams, even their survival in this world. And her knowledge had only grown with the passage of time and a greater understanding of how the world worked. As a child, Rose had often wondered why she couldn't just be a part of Grafton Crest and all the folk who lived there. She had naively imagined that they would see her for who she was and like her regardless of her family. Sadly, she was still waiting for that day to come. "Well, if you don't pick yourself up, Rose, then Daddy will just have to find a husband for you. I'm sure there'll be a man out there willing to take you on for the right price." Louisa fixed her younger sister with a glare, not noticing how her own husband looked at her sideways, disapproving of her obvious spite. They had to be just about the unhappiest couple in all of Grafton Crest, but Rose reserved the largest helping of her pity for Brandon Welby, the banker's son. He had fallen for the glamour, the shining curls, the New York fashions. The reality of his life, however, had turned out to be very different. He had a capricious wife with the attention span of a fruit fly, one who had become irritable since the wonder of a grand wedding had become a distant memory. Still, that was their path, not Rose's. She had her own life to lead, and it was her choice as to how it ought to be led. The same was true of Louisa and Brandon Welby. They were the only ones who could do anything about their unhappiness, and Rose wasn't particularly inclined to spend much more time mulling it over. "I would prefer to make such decisions for myself," Rose said with a little dignity, causing Gerald to snort with derision. "You're just a little madam," Gerald said with a mouthful of food. "I note that you're not yet married, Gerald, and you're 5 years older than I am," Rose said as she put down her knife and fork, her appetite all gone. Sunday was the very worst day of the week for Rose. After church, Dale always insisted on having his family around him. As if his children and grandchildren were just another one of his great successes in life. He sat at the head of the table, his shirt immaculate, his tie just about the narrowest there was to be seen in all of Colorado, with an exaggerated air of the patriarch about him. Rose's mother had passed away 3 years before, and she wished more than anything in the world that she could find it in her heart to miss her. She had been a woman with very few maternal instincts, proud of the look of Louisa as she had grown, without ever really getting to know her. Of course, such an idea would be entirely lost on Louisa, who would only ever remember being admired. As for Rose, her mother had long since stopped paying her much attention. Despite the fact she had been a pretty child, Rose had never held herself in the same way that the rest of the family had. She had chosen a more local style for herself, always feeling out of place and somewhat ridiculous in the high-fashion dresses that her mother had always wanted her to wear. It had marked her out very early on in school as being different. Whereas her sister had wanted to stand out, her head held high, and her expression always satisfied, Rose had simply wanted to blend in. When she had refused to stand out as her sister did, she seemed to have faded from her mother's memory. Perhaps that had been her mother's way of letting her know what a disappointment she had turned out to be. Well, as far as mothers went, Eleanor Clayton had proved to be something of a disappointment too. Men get married when they want, Rose. Women get married when they're told, Gerald said in such a haughty manner that Rose almost laughed. He looked like a pettish little prince sitting there at his father's side. "That's not true, Gerald. I got married when I wanted, and to exactly whom I wanted to marry," Louisa said, deciding to take her own offense. "So says you, Louisa," Gerald bit back, and Rose smiled to herself, picking up her knife and fork and resuming her meal. Vanity's bonfire had been lit, and 2 of the vainest young people in all of Colorado were going to spend the rest of the meal snapping at one another. It suited Rose, for it meant that they would forget all about her once again. Rose thought it a sad thing that she would take refuge in her own invisibility. That invisibility, when all was said and done, hurt her almost as much as her family's open disappointment in her. Perhaps more so because that invisibility extended beyond the Clayton home and out into the community of Grafton Crest. The townsfolk feared the Claytons, that was for sure, and because of it they often showed deference to her brothers and her sister. But Rose was a quiet girl, reticent, one who looked up into the faces of others and hoped to see a smile there. Of all of them, she was no threat, and yet, of all of them, she was the one that the town chose to ignore. Perhaps they thought her an easy target, the only one of the Claytons whom they could get away with making their feelings silently known to. They would never dare ignore Louisa the way they did her. If only they would look at her and see her for who she really was. If they did that, Rose was certain that she would not be quite so alone. Chapter 3. Joel decided to take the scenic route back from town. His mother had ordered some yarn to make shawls for her granddaughters, and he'd been only too pleased to go down into the town when it arrived. He'd stopped in the diner, hoping for a little conversation to break up his day, but it was Monday, and the place was empty. Conversation was in short supply, especially in the years since Eileen Thornton had married Barney Brown and left the diner to help him set up their little farm. The current waitress, for they seemed to change every couple of months, served his coffee with a smile and then determinedly set about walking this way and that, leaning against the counter in a way which showed off her generous curves to the best effect. As displays went, it was surprisingly easy to ignore. Something about the solitude in a place where he had least expected to find it had given him the feeling that every day was the same. Every day was going to be the same until he decided to do something about it. He'd wondered once or twice about finding a wife, as if that might somehow be exactly what was lacking in his world. He was a sensible young man, one who knew that a person could make a decision in haste and repent at their leisure, especially as far as marriage was concerned. No, he was not ready for that step, just yet. The diner wasn't helping, and so, with nothing better to do, he made his way outside and tucked his mother's yarn into the saddlebag. It was time to head back to the ranch. He decided to take the long route, to wander along the tree-lined pathways in the late summer sunshine. The warm rays felt good on his skin, maybe they would help him decide, for nothing else seemed to help. Maybe some time alone to think was what he needed. This route would take him to the farthest edge of the ranch, a good hour if he took it slowly. Once he made it back to the ranch, it would take time for him to slowly walk his horse across their vast land and down to the ranch house to end his working day. Joel certainly wasn't a lazy young man, but his restlessness was producing a sort of procrastination, one he wasn't used to. And although it was making him feel worse somehow, he seemed to be trapped there. It was as if his own procrastination had made him too lethargic to do anything to help himself out of it. And so went his thoughts as he ambled along, his horse enjoying the steady pace, the clip-clop of his hooves rhythmic and soporific. Perhaps so soporific that Joel, who hadn't gone along these paths for some time, didn't see the low-hanging branch which swiped him clean off his horse's back. He landed with a thump on his hip, crying out an involuntary howl of pain as he did so. His horse, clearly as surprised as he was, stopped immediately and turned, looking down at his master with some concern, if horses truly felt such a thing. Joel rolled onto his backside, drawing his knee up into his chest to be sure that he hadn't done any permanent damage to his hip. He knew immediately that it was nothing serious, for his movement hadn't been at all impaired. However, it sure did hurt, and he winced as he released his knee and then drew it back in towards his chest again. "Are you all right?" He heard a woman's voice and the sound of footsteps running towards him. "I'm fine, thanks," he said, turning a little to look up and see who had come to his aid. "I heard you shout, you see." "I was just in the meadow there reading," the woman said, holding out the book she had clutched in her hand by way of explanation. Joel laughed, feeling a little embarrassed and foolish. It was a mixture of a low-hanging branch and a lack of concentration, he said, and began to laugh a little more before peering a little closer at the young woman. It was Rose Clayton. He recognized her, of course, although she seemed somehow different out there in the wilderness. Even so, he'd know her anywhere. He'd know any of the Claytons anywhere. His ready smile froze on his face, and he felt suddenly ridiculous, sitting there on his backside in the dust. Annoyed, he began to scramble up, perhaps a little too quickly, and he grunted in pain as his hip protested. "Maybe you should take it slowly, Joel," she said, letting him know that she recognized him too. "Maybe you landed badly. What's hurting? Can I help?" She moved closer, looking genuinely concerned. "I guess I landed on my hip kind of hard," he answered her question, realizing he had no option but to at least attempt to be gracious. She'd come running after all, hadn't she? And even when she had realized who she was dealing with, she still had the decency to be concerned about him. Closing his eyes for a moment, he wished that he could let go of the idea that she was somehow responsible for the death of his father. Joel knew that was ridiculous, but to accept assistance of any kind from a Clayton felt somehow like a betrayal of not only his father but his entire family. "Why not take my arm for a minute and see if you can walk all right?" She began to laugh a little, and he thought there was something quite sweet about it. "I'm not really strong enough to keep a man your size on his feet, but maybe I can lend a little bit of balance if nothing else." "Well, that sure is kind of you," he said in a voice which even he could tell sounded a little less than grateful. Nonetheless, Rose Clayton took a couple of steps towards him and held out her arm. He took it, and the two of them began to make a curious ungainly progress a few paces along the pathway. With every step, his muscles began to loosen a little and, as that tension decreased, so did the pain. "What do you think?" she inquired, turning her head to look at him. For some reason, Joel kept his gaze on some point in the distance, leaving Rose to speak to the side of his face. He knew that it was ungracious, truly ungrateful, but some internal struggles were stronger than others, weren't they? "I think I'll live," he said and gently extracted his arm, standing on his own 2 feet and smiling at her as best he could. "I guess it's not as bad as I'd first thought." He even laughed a little, his reasonable self, knowing that Rose couldn't possibly be to blame for the death of his father all those years ago. For one thing, she had only been a child herself at the time, just about the same age as he was. She couldn't really be blamed, and he knew it. He also knew that the somewhat shy and quiet girl couldn't exactly be compared to the rest of her family. There was a chalk and cheese element to it all, but still, it didn't make those few moments in her company any easier. "Well, that's good," she said and seemed suddenly shy, and he knew that she'd picked up on his reticence. "Will you be able to get back up onto your horse?" she went on as if determined to show some caring. "I reckon so," he said and took a few steps towards his horse. "I guess we'll soon see," he added, once again trying to laugh, trying to put her at her ease even though he knew he was the person who was causing all the awkwardness. Despite the last remnants of pain, Joel hopped up onto the saddle with ease and kept his wincing to an absolute minimum. He wanted to be away from there, anywhere that didn't involve him and one of the Claytons in such an isolated place. Of course, he didn't fear her, nor did he fear any of the Claytons anymore. They'd done their worst already. The events of 6 years before, when Dale Clayton had most certainly been behind the fire which had almost killed his sister, Elsie, had seemed to put the Claytons back in their box. At least as far as Wild Meadow Ranch went, at any rate. No, it wasn't fear he was feeling, it was the old anger. It was blame, it was unforgiveness, it was family loyalty. It didn't matter that Rose had been kind. It didn't matter that Rose had seemed to genuinely care. All that mattered was that Rose Clayton was, after all, a Clayton. "Well, I guess I'll leave you in peace, Joel," Rose said in a quiet and somewhat defeated voice which did something to his insides. He turned to look at her then, meeting her eyes for the first time in the encounter. Guilt heated his cheeks. It was not only for sharing a few minutes' conversation with a Clayton but for making that particular Clayton sound so crestfallen. "Thank you, Rose. I sure do appreciate it," he said and nodded, smiling as easily as he could manage before touching the brim of his hat and moving on. "You're welcome," she said quietly, her voice seeming to drift along on the warm breeze behind him. Chapter 4. As she watched him ride away, Rose felt her little world constricting once more. It had expanded for just a moment or two when the son of her father's supposed enemies had accepted her help. But she had seen what it cost him to accept that help, and it had made her feel foolish for even trying. Rose had seen his face change the moment he recognized her. It had taken every ounce of strength for her to not simply turn around and run away. The fact that he tried so hard to disguise his animosity had somehow made her feel all the worse. Almost a little pathetic, and it was certainly a feeling she didn't enjoy. It had occurred to her, in the beginning, to be angry about it. She considered leaving him to sit on his behind in the dust and march away. But something inside her reminded her of the old days, the days before everything had become so awful, the days in which Rose Clayton and Joel Meadows had been friends. They had been no more than 7 years old when Rose had first moved with her family from New York to Grafton Crest. She'd been excited about school then, even though not everybody took to the new girl with the fancy clothes. But Joel had been himself, not seeming to care or even notice the differences. Break time often found him chattering to her happily in the little yard outside the schoolroom where they were released for play every so often. And then had come the death of Cal Meadows. She had only been 9 years old, as had Joel, but she could remember every bit of it with clarity. At first, she felt sorry to hear about the dreadful loss suffered by the young boy she had considered a friend. But school being what it was, and children being unable to hold back the sentiments they had learned from their parents, Rose had been left in no doubt whatsoever that Cal Meadows had died as a result of her own father's actions. She was so aware of that fact that, by the time Joel returned to school from that period of mourning he'd shared with his bereft family, she could hardly look at him for shame. When she had approached him for the first time, Joel had simply looked at her with a sharp scowl, his 9-year-old eyes absolutely furious, before turning to walk away from her without a word. He'd never bullied her, not once, he'd just ignored her. He had his rudimentary understanding of the circumstances of his father's death and, knowing only one of the Claytons personally, could only find one person to blame. Rose. With a sigh, she turned to make her way back towards the meadow from where she had run on hearing Joel's shout of pain. She sat back down on the soft, warm grass in almost exactly the same spot and opened her book once again. However, it might as well have been upside down for all she was taking in, and so she closed it again and stared out across the pretty meadow. Rose felt so flat and disheartened that she wished she had never seen him at all. It was the first time in a long time that she had looked Joel Meadows square in the face, and he certainly had changed over the years. His hair was a little darker blonde than it used to be when he was a boy, but his eyes were still a shining bright blue. Beyond his eyes, there was very little trace of the boy, for he now had a strong jaw and a chin covered in dark blonde stubble. He was a handsome man, no doubt about it, and she idly wondered why it was she had never heard of a girl in his life. She was generally aware of him and his family at church, but just like when she was a little girl, Rose could never summon up the courage to look at them directly. She still felt that sense of shame, that feeling of dislocation, of being ostracized from the entire community. If she had managed to successfully help Joel Meadows, to reach him in some small way, perhaps it would have signified the first footsteps on the road to a better life. She couldn't blame him for thinking badly of her. The whole town was absolutely certain that her father was behind the fire, which almost took the life of one of Joel's sisters some years before. Knowing that she would get no peace from her mind if she simply sat there, Rose got to her feet and began to saunter through the meadow, making her way home. Of course, she felt no more included at home than she did in the town itself. She would almost think it worth marrying to escape all of it, but shuddered to think what sort of man her father would drum up for her. Whomever it was, the union would be more for his own purposes than hers, that was for certain. She would do much better to keep trying, to find some other way of easing herself a little more successfully into Grafton Crest life. Shaking her head, she laughed a little when she thought that beginning with Joel Meadows could be considered overreaching. It would be much better if she tried to appeal to somebody whose father was not driven into the grave by hers. Still, it could have been a lot worse. At least, he tried to smile instead of giving her the determined scowl. The one he treated her with so often throughout the remainder of her time at school. Screwing her face up in thought, Rose wondered, if looked at in a different light, the encounter might really be seen as a little victory of some sort. Not a victory over the Meadows family, never that, but a personal victory. If she could manage a few sentences with Joel, what could be achieved with the rest of the town? Perhaps the time had come for her to be a little braver. To go out into the world and start to look up into people's faces again. As a child, she had almost relentlessly sought some response from anybody. Smiling up at people when they came out of church or as she passed them in the street. Day after day, she tried until she had come to the conclusion that she would never get anywhere with such an approach. She'd been a child then, but she was a woman now. Rose wondered if she might have a little better success. Not aimlessly wandering the streets smiling at people, of course, but going to the places they went, being where they were, and seeing what came of it. There were all sorts of little events in town, places she would undoubtedly have to attend alone. She most certainly could not take any member of her family with her and hope to make friends. The idea of striking out on her own in such a way, of being so conspicuous for being so alone, filled her with dread. Can there really be any harm in trying? She muttered quietly to herself. What was really to be lost in a town where she had slowly become invisible? And perhaps there was everything to be gained, especially if she could find a life of her own that was far removed from the life she had in the Clayton family home. But of course, that would be running before she could walk. First things first, Rose needed to summon up the courage to find and attend an event. She mulled it over all the way home and realized that she could probably do no better than attend the town barn dance. It was held almost every week and, she believed, well attended. Her sister used to go once in a great while, but that was some years ago, and she had never offered to take Rose with her. Still, that was probably a good thing. By the time she reached home, Rose was actually smiling. While she wasn't entirely sure that she could claim her encounter with Joel Meadows to be a success, it had, at least, been a catalyst for something greater. And she only had 3 days to wait before the next barn dance. She wondered if that was just long enough to lose her nerve and talk herself out of it. Well, that was going to be up to her, to be brave, wasn't it? Chapter 5. By the time they'd reached the town barn, Joel was beginning to feel glad that he'd agreed to come. It had been a while since he'd attended, largely dating back to the beginning of his own restlessness. But Elsie had been determined, telling him that she had already told Jane, their eldest sister, that they would meet her and her husband there. In the end, he'd allowed his arm to be twisted, albeit gently so. Where are they going now? Joel asked as he watched his sisters disappear across the barn. They had been talking nonstop from the moment they arrived, leaving Tex and Joel to make the best of it. Jane's husband, David, was somewhere else in the barn deep in conversation with one of his clients. Not that Joel minded, of course, he reckoned he'd suffered more than enough over the years listening to his sisters gossip incessantly. And Tex Marshall, a feature in all their lives for the last 6 years or so, was certainly good company. Joel always liked the way that Tex treated him, as a grown man, rather than having it stuck in his head that he was still the boy he'd been 6 years ago. He smiled vaguely over at his sisters, the two biggest culprits of such behavior. I think I can answer that question, look, Tex said, pointing across the barn. Joel laughed when he spotted Eileen Thornton. His sister Jane's oldest friend and a woman so well known in Grafton Crest that everybody still referred to her by her maiden name. Eileen Thornton was just about the most determined conversationalist in the whole town. Looks like it's just us then, Tex, Joel said and laughed. We will not see much of them for the rest of the night. Well, at least I won't have to dance. That's something, Tex said and chuckled. That knee still giving you grief? Not as much as it was, just a twinge. But it's as good an excuse as any to lean against the wall with a drink. Your secret is safe with me, Joel said, peering about the barn idly. His eyes opened a little wider when he saw a woman he recognized tentatively making her way into the barn. He peered at her for the longest time, certain that he must have made a mistake. But when she came a little further into the barn, looking so ill at ease she was almost forlorn, he knew with certainty that it was Rose Clayton. His surprise seemed to allow him to stare for a little longer than was necessary, or polite, as he wondered what on earth she was doing there. In all the years he'd sporadically attended the barn dance, he'd certainly never seen her there. He couldn't claim to know her well anymore, but he had an idea that this wasn't really her sort of thing. She was a quiet type, and certainly not the sort of young woman he would imagine being comfortable walking into the place on her own. And yet there she was, undeniably unaccompanied. Furtively, her eyes looked this way and that, almost as if searching for a friendly face. And then it hit him, she wouldn't find a friendly face there that night. Joel watched as she seemed to take in a deep breath, bracing herself a little before walking more determinedly towards the refreshments. She looked as if she was fighting an urge to turn and run, and something about it all made him feel suddenly very shabby indeed. Seen someone you like the look of? Tex asked teasingly as he followed his brother-in-law's gaze. Yes, well, no. Just somebody I know. Well, new, really, he said falteringly. That's the youngest Clayton girl, isn't it? Tex said in a matter-of-fact voice. Yes, Rose Clayton, Joel said, and felt almost as if he were admitting to betraying the family in some way. Poor thing, she looks kind of lost, Tex continued. Yes, I suppose she does. But if she's come in here on her own, she will likely stay that way. Why? Tex said, surprising him entirely. Well, she's one of the Claytons, isn't she? Yes, but that normally means people doing a little fawning and crowing, doesn't it? The rest of them, yes, but not Rose. No, not Rose, Tex said, somewhat knowingly. What? Joel looked at him inquiringly. I remember her years ago when I first came into town, or not long after. She was coming out of the church with her family, just following along at the back of them all. The rest of them being what they are, their heads were held ridiculously high as the town parted to let them through. I guess she caught my eye, she didn't seem like the rest of them. Her head wasn't high, she was just twisting this way and that, trying to get a smile out of somebody. Poor kid, she never got one. You've got a good memory, Joel said. Not really. I guess I've noticed her ever since, and I don't see that much has changed, except that she doesn't seem to bother trying to look for smiles anymore. Shame. Well, I suppose after everything her father has done, Joel began. What? I mean, she was just a kid, wasn't she? I know Dale Clayton will still be up to his old tricks somewhere, but he hasn't dared come near Wild Meadow ever since. Anyway, should she really be held responsible for father's crimes? Tex studied him so intently that Joel had to look away. No, I suppose not. Joel looked down at his feet. What is it? You know, Rose and I used to be real good friends when we were kids. She was quiet, but she was good fun. And then my daddy died and he trailed off. You decided she couldn't be your friend anymore? I guess so. But I was just a little kid. As was she. Still, I don't reckon I'm any better now. I saw her the other day, Joel began, feeling a little more at his ease somehow. He'd never realized that he could talk about such things with Tex, but clearly, he could. Perhaps it was because Tex had only married his sister 6 years ago and had never known their father, Cal Meadows. He'd come in on the tail end of it all when the woman he would go on to marry was almost killed in the barn fire. Nonetheless, Joel reckoned that Tex could separate one Clayton from another easily enough without any of the old deep wounds that the rest of them had. What happened? I was coming along the back trail from town when I got knocked off my horse by a low-hanging branch. I guess I wasn't paying attention. Anyways, Rose was apparently sitting in the meadow reading when she heard me hit the ground. She came along to help me, and I guess I wasn't as gracious as I could have been. You were mean to her? Tex said and winced. No, not mean. I don't know, I guess I was polite and all, just not real warm. Tell me to mind my own business, Joel, but I reckon the fact that you weren't real warm is kind of getting to you. You strike me as regretting it, I suppose. I guess I do, he said slowly. I know I do. Then maybe you can return the favor and help the poor woman out a little bit now, the way she helped you? What do you mean? The poor thing is sitting in the corner of the barn out of the way, all alone. Look, she's clutching a drink and looking terrified. Why don't you go and sit with her for a minute? But she's a Clayton? Yes, I suppose she is. But don't you see, that's like me assuming that you are exactly like Elsie just because she's your sister, Tex said and chuckled. Come on, nobody on earth is like Elsie, Joel said, and they both laughed a little harder now. Somehow it made things easier. Could he really go right up to her and spend a few minutes? If he was honest, his conscience had been bothering him a little ever since his fall from his horse. But his conscience had gone beyond the few minutes they had shared by the meadow and had taken him all the way back to his school days. He'd known in his gut that there was something not quite right about it all, even as a child. True enough, but you take my meaning. You're nothing like Elsie, and I'm pretty certain that Rose Clayton is nothing like her father. Why don't you give the poor girl a chance? It sure doesn't look like anybody else is going to. But what about, he said, looking over his shoulder. Don't you worry about your sisters, I'll keep an eye out. And in any case, you get to choose your own friends, you don't need their permission. Well, I guess it couldn't hurt, Joel said, shrugging before turning to make his way to the very back of the barn. Chapter 6. When she realized that Joel Meadows was making his way to her, Rose didn't know where to look. It was a little gloomy in the town barn, and she couldn't make out his expression. Was he coming to tell her that she wasn't welcome, that she didn't fit? For surely, he wasn't coming to pass the time of day with her, not right there in front of half the town. Her mouth went dry, as did her throat, and she took a hasty gulp of the fruit punch. She was almost at the bottom of the cup, having sipped it nervously every few seconds ever since she'd found herself a hay bale out of the way of everybody else. Suddenly, her big decision to go out that night, to be brave, didn't feel like the personal victory she had imagined when she had got herself dressed for the evening. As always, she wore modest clothing, even though she had some very fine and completely unworn dresses in her closet. But the dull pink short-sleeved dress she wore was pretty, looking nice enough against her thick dark hair without making her look like the arrogant belle of the ball her sister always appeared to be. In terms of dress, if nothing else, Rose certainly fit in with the other women of Grafton Crest. Still, the dress hadn't helped her when she'd wandered in through the door. She'd been feeling every bit as conspicuous as she might have been had she decided to wear her finest dress and march into the barn like she owned the place. That's what Louisa would have done. It was almost as if she couldn't win. The difference was that Louisa really didn't care if people liked her or not. All Louisa cared about was that they noticed her and listened to her and always let her have her way. And the fact was that Louisa had achieved all those things. But Rose was not broken from the same mold, and she knew it. She would just have to be exactly who she was and, with that in mind, she braced herself before looking up into Joel Meadows' face. "Good evening, Rose," he said in a sheepishly friendly way which almost had her fainting with relief. So, he hadn't come marching over to remonstrate with her, that was something. "Hello, Joel," she said and smiled, clutching the cup of punch to settle down the little bout of shaking. "I guess I just wanted to thank you for the other day." He seemed awkward as he looked over his shoulder. "I reckon I wasn't too gracious, but I know you went out of your way to help me." "That's all right. And you were perfectly polite, please don't worry," she said, suddenly determined to put him at his ease even while she felt rattled enough to evaporate. "It's good of you to say, Rose, but perfectly polite isn't necessarily real friendly, is it? I wanted to say that I'm sorry for it." He looked over his shoulder again, and she realized that he was not entirely comfortable to be seen with her. Of course, his family might be out there somewhere in the crowd, and she supposed it was understandable. Nonetheless, it still hurt a little. But she was pragmatic, and she knew that she must keep striving. She must take her little victories where she could find them. "Well, I accept your apology, and I thank you for making it. I guess you don't have real cause to be my friend." As she looked up at him shyly, Rose realized that her words had had an effect. Joel looked suddenly a little ashamed, and she wondered if she ought to have picked her words more carefully. He was a tall man and seemed even taller standing over her as she sat on the hay bale, and she was relieved when he finally sat down next to her. He was certainly a gentleman, perching on his own end of the hay bale and removing his hat. His dark blonde hair was thick and a little ruffled from the hasty hat removal, a little messy the way it had always been at school. Still, it was strange to think of him as the little boy, especially when he had grown into such a handsome man. He was wearing dark brown trousers, and a tan checked shirt with tan boots, and it all suited his coloring real well. "I don't think I've ever seen you here at the barn dance," he went on, seeming to her that he was searching for some sort of inconsequential conversation they could have between them. "I've never been before. My sister used to come here, but I suppose I was a bit too young back then. She wouldn't have wanted me with her anyway." She laughed, somewhat nervously. "But I thought I might like to give it a try, and so here I am." Rose shrugged her shoulders and could feel her cheeks warming up, grateful that it was probably too gloomy in the barn for him to notice. "What do you think of it?" he went on, seeming a little edgy as if he might be discovered there with her at any moment. "Everybody seems to be having fun, that's for sure," she said in as cheerful a tone as she could manage given her nerves. "And what about you? Are you having fun?" "To be honest, I kind of hid myself away over here. I thought I had the guts to do it, but maybe not in the end. Coming here on my own and all, I guess I felt like I stood out, and I'm not too comfortable about standing out." "Me either," he said and laughed in a friendly way which suggested he was trying to put her at ease. "So, I guess you're here with your family," she said when he looked furtively across the barn again. "My sisters and their husbands." "My sisters are in the throes of some deep conversation or other, and their husbands have been left to their own devices," he said and laughed. "That's nice." Rose didn't know what else to say. The very mention of his sisters made her cheeks redden all the more. She knew, without a doubt, that her father had paid for somebody to cause the damage which had almost killed Elsie. He'd never admitted it, always railing against the accusation that Tex Marshall had made on the day that he'd burst into their home. Even in front of his own family, Dale Clayton couldn't admit what he'd done. The fact that he spent so many years afterward holding on to his self-righteous indignation shocked, That anybody could think he had done such a thing was not only laughable but somehow diminished him even further in the eyes of his youngest child. Even then, she'd known. And when she'd gone back to school some days later, Joel had glared at her once again. He blamed her for that too, and she had somehow managed to blame herself also. "What about you? How come you're here by yourself? I mean, I know you said your sister hasn't been in a while, but isn't there anybody else you could come with? A friend, maybe?" "No, there isn't," she said and looked down at her lap, feeling a little pathetic. "Not that it matters, you live here in the town, and you can come into the barn dance any time you like." He seemed embarrassed now. "It's all right, Joel, you don't have to feel sorry for me. I know I'm like a fish out of water tonight here in the barn, but only because I was foolish enough to come. As for the rest, not having any friends, that's not a new thing. In fact, it's something that I have grown very used to over the years." She smiled and shrugged her shoulders, letting him off the hook. Once again, he looked a little ashamed, and she knew why. She knew that he was thinking of their school days, of how they had once been friends. But she hadn't intended to make him feel that way, not if she was hoping to find a friend at last. It was just the truth, plain and simple. There was no other way for her to answer his questions. "I guess I feel sorry about that," he said before looking over his shoulder once again. "You don't have to worry about that," she said, pleased that he was speaking to her but so exhausted from the nervousness that brief conversation had engendered. "I'll probably be getting along in a minute, Joel, but thank you for coming over. You didn't really need to apologize, but thanks anyway." "Well, I guess I'll see you, Rose," he said, rising to his feet as if a little relieved to be so politely released. "I'll see you, Joel," she replied automatically, smiling as he popped his hat back onto his head and touched the brim. It reminded her of his polite departure of just days before. But this time, he was smiling properly, with more warmth, and Rose decided to assume this little encounter to be a victory. As he wandered away, she gulped down the last of the fruit punch, feeling the cold liquid as it hit her tense stomach. It was brief, very brief. He hadn't stayed long, and yet she knew that those few minutes would be something that she would remember for a very, very long time. Chapter 7. Joel had gladly accepted the routine challenge of heading out onto the plains beyond the farthest reaches of wild meadow to round up the stray escapees. It had been 6 years since deliberate gaps had been made in the perimeter fencing, but the cattle were not above causing such damage themselves. His head had been full of nothing but Rose Clayton ever since the barn dance on Saturday night, and he welcomed the opportunity to spend some time alone. He knew he had not been himself ever since, and was glad now that his restlessness had already been noted by Garth and, most likely, his mother. One thing was for sure, Joel would not be able to give an absolutely full and honest account of his latest reason for being a little distracted. How could he give them the reason that he was in want of the peace and quiet that solitary working provided? What would he say? There was no answer to that question that would not cause someone some pain. He was some distance from the edge of the ranch when he heard approaching hooves and turned to see that Garth was coming towards him. His stepfather smiled as he always did, and, knowing that he was unlikely to be able to easily get the cattle back without a little help, Joel smiled in return. "I wondered if they might have drifted off a good way, and it seems like they have," Garth said with a hearty laugh. "But they never go out of sight entirely, do they? They know where they get fed, Garth. The only problem with cattle is they can never remember exactly where it was they came out. They end up sadly roaming the fencing looking for some way back home after their little escapades. Not to mention the belligerents," he said and grinned humorously as he watched Garth survey the disparate little group. "I guess they're like flies." flying in through an open window and then spending the next hour bashing their heads against a closed one trying to get out again. Now, that is the truth, Joel said, and was greatly amused at the idea of the huge cattle behaving like flies. For the next 20 minutes, the two of them painstakingly got every single straggler through the gap in the fencing, herding them down into the next field, closing the gate and keeping them out of temptation's path. When they had finished, Joel decided that he would make the repairs there and then. "Are you not stopping for something to eat?" Garth asked when Joel looked set to ride off in the direction of the timber store in the next field. "Is it that time already?" Joel feigned surprise, knowing full well that it was already beyond midday. There was just something a little unsafe in spending downtime with Garth. Without the distraction of the other ranch hands there, Joel was sure that his stepfather would easily get to the bottom of what was bothering him. It would be much safer if he could simply get on with his work, but he knew that would not be happening now. "Come on, let us take a break," Garth said, brooking no argument. Joel took his food parcel out of the saddlebag and reluctantly sauntered to the place where Garth had already sat himself down. He took out some bread and a piece of cheese and hastily bit a large chunk out of them both, filling his mouth with food. That was one way not to talk. Though he knew this was playing for time, he didn't want to make a mistake. He didn't want to let her name slip, given that it had drifted around his mind for several days. "How's the thinking coming along?" Garth asked, clearly undeterred by the solid mouthful of food that Joel was slowly chewing. "The thinking," he mumbled through the breadcrumbs. "Your plans for the future, Joel. You still seem kind of out of sorts." "More than ever, I reckon." "Oh, I guess that is just the thinking," Joel said and swallowed his food. "I guess I haven't really come to any conclusions yet. More likely than not, I'll come out of this mood somehow and stay put." He smiled disarmingly. "Only if that will make you happy. If not, I reckon you will just have to keep thinking." Garth said about his own meal, and the two of them remained silent for some time before he began again. "There's nothing else bothering you, is there? You really do seem troubled, son," Garth said and looked at him earnestly. It was wonderful coming from a family who were so caring, but, at the same time, a little maddening when you were trying to keep a secret close to your chest. He tried to remind himself that he was only thinking about the girl, not marrying her. It was hardly the biggest betrayal imaginable. And yet still it felt as if it were. "No, not really. I can't think of anything," Joel added a languid shrug in the hope that he would appear believable. "Because you really can tell me anything." "Anything at all," Garth went on. "I know that, Garth," Joel grinned at him. He hated holding back, especially when Garth was, as always, being so kind. But the whole family had suffered at the hands of the Claytons, and there was no way on earth that he could admit to one or two finer feelings for their youngest daughter. But were they finer feelings? Yes, he thought they were. He'd felt her nervousness almost across the barn and had recognized his own urge to do something about it. He hadn't spoken to her for long, but he sure had enjoyed it. It was nerve-wracking, of course, given that his eagle-eyed sisters were in the self-same barn, but it had been pleasant, nonetheless. And he knew that Tex had not given him away, as well as he knew that his sisters had not seen him talking to Rose. In fact, he doubted they had seen Rose Clayton in the barn that night at all, for he was certain that they would have mentioned it if they had. The truth was that they were never particularly scathing about Rose like they were with the other Claytons. More often than not, any reference to her was simply that they had seen her somewhere and nothing more. A very different case indeed from Louisa Clayton, who was so haughty and self-satisfied that any sight of her always drew the sharpest conversation from either or both of his sisters. As with everybody else in Grafton Crest, Rose Clayton was somehow just a little beneath their notice. She had been a little beneath his notice too, in the years since he had shrugged off his old childhood friend. The problem was, she was not entirely beneath his notice anymore. Joel had realized for the first time, as he'd stared down at her sitting on that bale of hay, that she was very beautiful. She was a world apart from her glamorous sister, but there was something so much more natural about her. The soft, clear skin, her simple pale pink dress, and the gentle waves of her dark hair that ran down her back. She'd clearly made some effort with her hair, pulling it up at the front and pinning it in a way which kept it off her pretty face. It was beautiful, but certainly not the immaculate ringlets that Louisa Clayton often sported and always liked to swing around. Then there were her eyes. They were hazel and almond-shaped, large enough to make them stand out. She had full lips, and he wondered what she would look like if she truly smiled. A wide and happy smile, instead of the brief and self-conscious one she generally gave. "So, there's nothing else bothering you?" Garth broke in over his thoughts. "No, nothing at all," Joel said, and made a point of taking another extraordinarily large bite of bread. It didn't matter what sort of person Rose was, to his family she would always be a Clayton and nothing more. The wounds which had been inflicted on them all were far too deep to ever truly heal. Sadly, he knew then that he could never, ever talk to any of them about her. Tex had been kind enough to listen, and he knew that he would never have given him away. But still, there was more to this great big mixed family at Wild Meadow than just Tex Marshall, and so he would do better to forget all about the shy young woman who had once been his friend. "Well, that fence won't mend itself," Joel said, still chewing as he rose to his feet. "All right, son." "All right," Garth said, eyeing him curiously, and Joel knew that he was kidding no one. Chapter 8. Rose walked nervously into the diner, clutching her book. She hadn't intended on reading it anywhere other than the meadow, but it would give her something to do if she needed a distraction from her racing heartbeat. There were only a few people in the diner, and she was glad of that, especially when the waitress, a woman she didn't know at all, eyed her coolly. Well, she might not know who the waitress was, but it was clear that the waitress knew exactly who she was. Rose smiled shyly at the woman, expecting and getting nothing in return, before hastily making her way to one of the booths. She hadn't intended to sit in a booth, given that this was another point on her pathway to making a life for herself in Grafton Crest. As it was, her bravado was dying a quick death, and she suddenly wanted the safety of a booth's walls. Hot on the heels of her small victory at the barn dance, Rose had decided to keep up that forward momentum. That was how she had ended up in the diner. Having decided that she would eat there before continuing to the meadow, where she went several days a week to sit in peace and read, while the weather was still good, at any rate. But today was to be different. She was to eat with the people of Grafton Crest instead of carrying her own food with her to the meadow. She was to overcome her nerves and hopefully find at least one person who would care to pass the time of day with her. It had all seemed so good in theory, as she had run over the details of her little meeting with Joel Meadows in the town barn. With every silent retelling of it, her own part had become braver and much less nervous. That victory was edging her, cajoling her, and finally leading her to the diner, where she now sat as nervous as a kitten as the sour-faced waitress approached. "What can I get you?" the woman said plainly, a tiny notebook in one hand and an impossibly small pencil in the other. "Good morning, how are you?" Rose asked brightly, her cheeks already reddening with embarrassment. "It's afternoon," the woman said with an expression that would have been disdainful were it not so flat. "Of course, it is," Rose said, and laughed self-deprecatingly as she shook her head from side to side. "Well, could I have a slice of apricot pie and a mug of coffee, please?" The woman scribbled it down, the scratching of her pencil on the paper just about the only thing that could be heard in all the diner. It was as if everybody there had fallen silent, although she was certain that they hadn't been making a great deal of noise beforehand. There really were so few of them. Perhaps she had chosen the wrong day. Or perhaps she had chosen the right day, for if it were crowded, perhaps she would never have dared to walk in through the door in the first place, or if she had, perhaps she would now be running out. Once she'd finished writing down Rose's order, the waitress nodded without saying a word and turned to saunter away. Wasting no time, Rose opened her book at an entirely random page and lowered her head, pretending to read. This had been a mistake. This had all been a dreadful mistake. "Good afternoon, Joel," she heard the waitress call out brightly. Surely, it couldn't be him. Of all the people on all the days, surely it couldn't be Joel Meadows. It must be some other Joel. "Good afternoon," the man replied, and it was unmistakably Joel. Rose hardly knew what to do for the best, and so, in the end, she kept her eyes fixed on the book and hoped that the booth would provide adequate cover. "Can I have some pie and coffee, please?" Joel went on, and she could hear his boots on the wooden flooring as he made his way further into the diner. "Sure thing, Joel," the waitress said, her brightness making her almost unrecognizable from the woman who had so sullenly taken Rose's order. "You just go on and take a seat, honey." "Thank you," Joel said, polite but pleasingly nowhere near as effusive as the waitress. He took a seat at the table not far from her booth, and it was clear that the moment he looked around, he would see her sitting there. Rose knew that she couldn't continue to simply stare down at her book and pretend she didn't see him. She would look like a fool. "Good afternoon," she said in a near whisper, catching his attention and causing him to turn around. "Good afternoon, Rose." He looked surprised to see her there, and she was reminded of the way he had perpetually looked over his shoulder at the barn dance, not wanting to be seen with her. At that moment, the waitress came with a tray containing pie and coffee. Rose smiled up at her, still determined to make every bit of progress that she could. "Thank you," she said, but the waitress ignored her entirely and set the coffee and pie down on Joel's table, so he was to be served first. Embarrassed again, Rose looked back down at her book, her cheeks flaming. "Rose?" Joel said as the waitress wandered away, presumably to finally get Rose's order ready. Rose looked up at him and smiled awkwardly, realizing that she would have given anything for her face to not look so red, for she was most certain that it did. "Foolish of me, I thought it was mine," she mumbled. "Nothing foolish about it. You were here before me, after all," he said and turned to look back towards the waitress who was finally pouring Rose's coffee. He looked annoyed, and something about his expression gratified her a little. He'd seen the slight, and he didn't like it. Turning back, he looked down at his plate and cup and took a deep breath. He raised his head and looked for all the world to have come to some sort of a conclusion. He stood up quite suddenly, and Rose wondered if he was going to walk down to the front of the diner and have it out with the waitress. She held her breath, but he didn't. He lifted his plate and his cup and made his way to join Rose in the booth. She could have cried, it was such a wonderfully kind thing to do. "Do you mind?" he asked and smiled at her, already setting down his plate and cup on the table. "No, not at all. It would be nice to have some company," she said truthfully, as the fire mercifully died in her ordinarily pale cheeks. "Your order," the waitress said without any hint of warmth as she noisily set Rose's coffee and pie down in front of her. "Thank you," Rose said, but the waitress, casting a disappointed look at Joel, turned to hurry back to the counter. "That was rude, Rose." "She shouldn't have done that," Joel said, lowering his voice so that the two of them might talk privately. "You mustn't worry, Joel. I'm used to it, she said, yet more truth flying from her mouth. She doesn't have to like me, does she? I can't see any reason for her to not. Can't you? Rose said and wished she hadn't. He looked suitably chagrined. I'm sorry I didn't spend much time with you at the barn dance on Saturday, he said, smiling ruefully as he looked into her eyes. For all my talk, it looks as if I am not much different from the rest, does it? You most certainly are different, she began. To spend a few minutes with me is far more than most people do. People just find it easier to ignore me than they do my siblings, I suppose. I know what my father has done in this town, and I'm not proud of it. But there's nothing I can do about it either, you see, she said and realized that she still held her book open in front of her. She closed it gently and set it to one side, reaching for her fork and taking her first mouthful of the wonderful pie. Do you often come in here to read? He asked, changing the subject a little. No, I almost never come in here. I usually take a little food with me and sit in the meadow at the side of the path, where you fell from your horse. I suppose I thought I would try something different today. Well, I'm glad you did, he said and smiled at her so openly that she almost gasped. She had already decided that he was a handsome man, but he was a genuine treat to behold when he smiled without any hint of reserve. So am I, she said and realized that she now had another small victory under her belt. Chapter 9. Every day for 3 days straight, Joel had sneaked away from the ranch to make his way to the little meadow. Ever since their meeting in the diner, he hadn't been able to stop thinking about Rose Clayton, and he knew he wanted to see her again. The truth was that nothing particularly startling was said in those few minutes in which they shared a booth and ate pie. They had passed the time of day after a somewhat awkward start. She had been right to say that she was used to poor treatment, and he knew that he had been just one more person in Grafton Crest to bestow it. But from there, they had gone on to talk about her occasional afternoons sitting in the meadow. How she would go there, as long as the weather was fine, eating some bread and apples and reading her book. They had talked a little of her book, although Joel had to admit to not doing a great deal of reading since they'd left school. And that was it, that was the sum total of the conversation they'd had. And yet, somehow it had felt like so much more. There wasn't another person in all of Grafton Crest with whom he could have had so light a conversation and have added so much weight to it. It wasn't the conversation, it was his talking partner. And so, in its own way, that light conversation had been something quite momentous. He'd risen from his seat and purposely joined Dale Clayton's daughter at her table, taking her side, standing up for her for all to see. Of course, there were so few people in the diner, and none of them were particularly paying him and Rose any heed. It was only the waitress who had let her eyes widen when she saw the two of them sitting together. The poor thing spent the rest of the time pouting in the corner, disappointed that she had not been able to attract Joel away from Rose. For the next few days, Joel had waited for any sign that news of his mild indiscretion had made its way to the ears of his family. Both his mother and Garth had been in town on separate occasions, and Elsie seemed to miss nothing, even if she stayed on the ranch. But nothing was said, and none of his loved ones seemed to have changed their opinion of him in the slightest, and so he assumed that this time at least, he was undetected. Walking his horse slowly along the path he had been on when she had come to his aid, Joel was careful to look out for that low-hanging branch. Perhaps somebody else had fallen foul of it, for he could see it laying at the side of the path, its splintered end a testament to the fact that somebody had wrenched it from the trunk. He turned his horse into the meadow and began to slowly walk in. Once again, he was certain that Rose wouldn't be there, and he already felt a little flat. So, when his eyes fell on her sitting on the grass with the book on her lap as she ate some bread and cheese, his mouth fell open. "Joel," she said, setting the bread down on the waxed paper and looking up at him quizzically. She looked so pretty in her pale blue checked dress, her soft waves twisted into a loose bun and pinned at the back of her head. He realized then that he hadn't come up with a plausible excuse for being there in the first place and decided, in the end, that he would just have to tell her the truth. "I wondered if you'd be here reading your book," he said and held his breath for a moment. "Yes, here I am," she said, and her cheeks were flushing as prettily as they had done in the diner. "I have some bread and cheese. Would you like to share?" she went on. He jumped down from his horse and left it to roam in the meadow. He knew he wouldn't go far, not while there was lush, thick green grass to feast upon. "Thank you," he said and sat down next to her, accepting the slice of bread and cheese. "Will you not be missed? You work on the ranch, don't you?" she asked conversationally as she set her book to one side. "No, I won't be missed. I was working at the far end of the ranch. It's a huge place now, and the area I was working is closer to here than it is to the house." He knew he was giving her boring details, but now that he was with her, he didn't know what else to say. "I suppose it's nice to take a break. I've never worked before, so I don't really know," she said and looked a little awkward. "So, you didn't eat in the diner today?" he ventured. "No, I haven't been back since. To be honest, I'm a little afraid. Not as afraid as I was that first time, but it didn't exactly go well." She shrugged. "I don't mean you, of course," she added hurriedly. "I mean the waitress. She made me feel awkward, and I'll have to take a good steadying breath before I go back in there. But I will," she added the last as if to herself. "It sounds like more of a chore than a delight," he said inquiringly. "It is, I suppose. Like the barn dance, I decided that I needed to be brave and get out into the world a bit more. I can't expect anybody in Grafton Crest to like me if they don't know anything about me, can I? And is it important to you that they like you? I suppose it is, given that the alternative is rather lonely." "Sorry, that was tactless of me." "No, it was just an honest question, and I didn't mind it at all." "An honest question to which you gave a very honest answer," he said slowly. She really was so beautiful and such a gentle soul that he wanted to reach out and touch the soft skin of her face. Joel knew he was playing with fire, tempting himself to take the first steps on a path which would cause so much upheaval for them both. "It is nerve-wracking, I must admit. Walking into the barn, walking into the diner, I guess it reminds me of school. Nobody is particularly mean to me, but nobody is particularly kind either. Still, I'll keep trying. And some good already came out of it, didn't it? I enjoyed those few minutes at the barn dance in your company, and it was kind of you to sit with me in the diner. So, all is not lost, is it?" Once again, Joel was transported back to his school days. He remembered the bitterness in his heart, his broken heart, when he silently blamed Rose for his father's death. But just as Tex had said, she had been a child just like him, a child with no control over the world around her. A child who ought not to have been blamed for anything. "I know I made you feel bad back then. At school, I mean. I know better now. I should never have done it. I should never have turned my back on you, Rose," he said, staring down at the bread in his hand. There was a warm breeze which rustled the soft green grass of the meadow. It was a gentle, magical sound, bringing with it the scent of so many wildflowers that he couldn't pick one from the other. This was a romantic setting, he knew it. He knew better still that he ought not to have been there with Rose. "Clayton. I know that you were hurting back then, Joel. What child wouldn't be, having suffered the death of his father? But I know you were angry too, and you had every right to be. I'm not blind to my father's behavior. I know what happened and I don't blame you for your anger. Perhaps I did have a right to my anger, but with your daddy, not you. But we were just little kids, she said gently and gave him a warm and reassuring smile. But it's been a long time since I was a kid, Rose, as kind as it is of you to let me off the hook. He laughed sadly. My father has hurt a lot of people since we arrived here in Grafton Crest. He's not a man who cares at all about community, he doesn't want to be a part of it. He doesn't care about the poor even when he has more money than he could possibly ever spend. He isn't a good man, and I've always known that. He isn't a part of the town, he just wants to control it. But there isn't going to be anything I can do about that, not now, not ever. However much I regret it, he will always do what he wants to, and I wish I had come from any other family but my own. That must be very hard for you, he said. Joel thought of his own family, so close that it was hard for him to hide his feelings from them at times. What would life be like if he didn't have them? If he had grown up in some other family? A family he didn't want to be a part of, just as Rose didn't want to be a part of hers. It struck him then that her life was not only lonely in the town at large, but probably very lonely at home too. If only he knew her well enough to ask. Like much else, I suppose I'm used to it, she said and laughed as she handed him an apple. Here, help me finish this food, and let's talk about something a little bit brighter. How often do you come here? He asked, feeling himself being inextricably drawn to a future he would never have believed. Just a couple of times a week, if the weather is good. I only ask because I sure would like to see you again. I've enjoyed sitting here with you, he said and risked a look into her eyes to see if he could read anything in them. Those pretty hazel almonds looked back at him, brightening, and he knew that his words had made her happy. He was, after all, offering to be her friend, again. Perhaps one friend, even if it was one who had not been particularly true in the past, was better than nothing. I'd like that, she said, and her pretty cheeks blushed again. Chapter 10. Rose had barely been able to concentrate on a single thing that Reverend Waters had said. After seeing Joel and his family come into the church for the service that day, her mind had gone back to its determined and regular occupation of thinking about him. They had met several times now in the meadow, and she had been so surprised to see him the second time. Even though he'd said he wanted to see her again, she hadn't allowed herself to believe it entirely until he appeared once more. They'd talked a little of school, although it was clearly still something of a painful subject for them both. They talked of their lives since, of Joel's doubts about his place there at Wild Meadow Ranch, about her own emptiness at never having been allowed to take on an occupation of any kind. The conversation had become personal very quickly, and yet it felt right. They laughed a little, joked a little, and sometimes it felt as if they had always been friends, never once breaking their allegiance in the way they truly had. But as he'd walked into church, Rose had been forced to ignore him. Her sister had come to join her, but only so that she might leave her husband with her two very poorly behaved children. They were indeed ill-mannered brats, just as Louisa had always been, and Rose thought it amusing that her sister found them trying. Surely, she must recognize herself in them, and yet it seemed not. She had engaged Rose in some pointless conversation, using her so that she might spare herself her maternal duties for the remainder of the service. Knowing that she was being used and not caring at all for her sister's conversation, Rose didn't listen to a word she said and hardly bothered to pretend that she was. She was thinking about Joel and, when his family had walked past, and he'd turned to smile at her, she had been too startled to smile back. Her sister was so close that she was almost leaning on her as they sat in the pew, and Rose found herself frozen, unable to return that simple pleasantry from the man she was growing to like more and more. In that moment, she realized exactly how Joel must have felt at the barn dance. Although she hadn't entirely taken it to heart, the way that he had looked over his shoulder to check that he wasn't seen talking to her had hurt just a little. But it wasn't his fault, was it? No more than it was her fault now that she could not respond to his gentle, handsome smile. Not only would his family not be at all happy about their budding friendship, but she was certain that her own father would be furious. By the time the Clayton family had returned home, Rose felt sad and a little empty. She knew she ought not to worry about the future, especially since she and Joel were such new friends, but she couldn't help it. Her father would be furious, and his family would never, ever accept her. What life was there to be had? What chance was there for this new friendship to become anything more than it was now? She knew, of course, that even if there was some hope, Joel might not necessarily be feeling what she was starting to feel. "Well, dinner smells good," Louisa said, somewhat magnanimously since she had been spared the entire church service from having to have anything to do with her own children. "Run down into the kitchen and have one of the maids give you something, my dears. You really are too naughty today to sit at the table with us," she went on, and Rose almost snorted. Would that woman never pay her own children any heed whatsoever? As always, the meal was ready for them by the time they had walked in through the door of the Clayton house. Rose wondered if any member of her family understood what a privilege it was to be fed, to have so much, to never have to lift a finger. As she took her seat at the table, she thought that she very much doubted it. "So, Daddy, have you found a potential husband for my plain little sister yet?" Louisa asked, returning to her spiteful self the moment her children were out of the way, and she didn't need Rose's conversation anymore. "Perhaps not yet, Louisa, but the Devereaux family are coming over from Mayfield next month. They have a very fine son, Brad, I believe his name is," Dale Clayton said, speaking entirely to Louisa and ignoring Rose. "Isn't it lumber they're in, Daddy?" Louisa went on in a gossipy fashion. "Yes, they have lumber yards all over northern Colorado now. Still, as long as they don't look to buy one here in Grafton Crest, all will be well," he went on, and Rose was reminded of just how ruthless he was. He would marry her away into this family and yet attack them all roundly if they dared step a toe into what he saw as his territory. Did he think of nothing else but acquisition? "I don't think I remember much about them, Daddy." "Is Brad a handsome man?" "I couldn't say, Louisa." "Does it matter?" "No. It would for me, but I doubt it would for Rose. It's probably more a case of getting him to agree to things than her anyway, isn't it?" Now, Louisa. "Let's have none of that," he said, standing up for Rose, but only just. In her mind's eye, she played the scene of how Joel Meadows had stood up for her. How he had risen from his seat in the diner and joined her at her table. In doing so, he had truly stood up for her, far more than anybody else had ever done, her father included. She had no idea at all what Brad Devereaux was like, feeling certain that she had never met him before. So, she was to be married away fortuitously, just like Louisa had been, if the proud little madam would ever admit it. But how could she be? Now that she had found a man who had already stepped over such great obstacles to be in her company, how could she think of anybody but Joel Meadows? But how could she tell him that? Worse still, how could she tell her family? She realized then just how trapped she was, how small and insignificant. So insignificant, in fact, that she didn't even have a say over her own life. Just when she had begun to think she was making progress, that she might find a life that worked for her in the end, here was her father about to ruin everything. As her dinner was served and her mouth went dry, Rose knew that her appetite had deserted her entirely. Chapter 11. I'm sure you don't have to get permission to wander off the ranch, Joel. And if you do, you sure don't have to get it from me, Tex said and chuckled. I know, but if anybody asks, I just went for a little wander to clear my head is all, Joel said and felt certain that Tex could see clean through him. Something troubling you? No, nothing is troubling me. Someone? There was just the faintest hint of a smile on Tex's face, and Joel wouldn't have been at all surprised if that smart but quiet man had already figured it all out. Not sure yet, Joel said cryptically, and Tex nodded. It seemed to be answer enough for him. Joel climbed back up into the saddle and began to wander away. He knew where he was heading, of course, the meadow. He'd been working the very top part of the ranch for weeks now and was surprised that Garth hadn't asked him why. Even if he did ask, what could he say? He couldn't tell Garth or anybody else that it was more convenient. Given that it was closer to the meadow where he knew that Rose was already sitting waiting for him, contentedly reading her book until he arrived. When he spotted her, she didn't look quite as content as he'd imagined. Her book was open, but she was staring vaguely off across the soft grass of the meadow at the wildflowers which bordered it on all sides. She was so lost in thought that she didn't hear him approach and was startled when he jumped down out of the saddle and landed heavily. "Oh, Joel," she said in a breathy way, holding a soft white hand over her chest as if to steady her heart. "I didn't mean to startle you, Rose." "You sure were in a world of your own then," he laughed and immediately began to unbuckle the saddlebag and remove his midday food parcel from within. Rose began to unpack her own food also, and it was some moments before they were finally sitting side by side and beginning to eat. "What's troubling you?" Joel asked, certain that she had something on her mind. She turned to look at him for a moment, creasing her brow as if in some confusion. But she very quickly relaxed her expression, and he was certain that she had been about to tell him that everything was fine before changing her mind and deciding to be honest with him. "I really am sorry I didn't smile back at you in church on Sunday. Louisa was right there with me, Anne." "Don't worry about it, I know what that's like," he said and rolled his eyes humorously, making her laugh. "I guess ours are not the easiest of circumstances for friends, are they?" "I guess not. I just didn't want to let it go by without an apology." As she took a bite of her bread and began to chew thoughtfully, Joel was certain that there was something else on her mind. She still didn't look any easier for having got her apology out of the way, and so he knew that it was nothing more than the preamble to something else, something worse. She looked so beautiful in a pale yellow dress, her shining dark hair pulled back into a playful-looking ponytail which had been tied with a yellow ribbon. No wonder he couldn't stop thinking about her, she was so beautiful. "What's really troubling you, Rose?" he asked in a quiet voice, peering at her. "You're quite good at this, aren't you?" She looked at him and grinned, and he was relieved to see it. "I like to think so," he said with an exaggerated shrug. "I guess there's no harm in telling you. My father is fixing to interfere in my life in just about the worst way possible," she began. "In what way?" Before he even knew what it was, Joel felt his spirit plummet down into the pit of his stomach. "Well, you probably know that he married Louisa off to the banker's son for his own aims. The whole town knows it, everyone except Louisa, of course, who is convinced that it was all her own choice. Anyway, he knows a family out in Mayfield, some sort of big noise in the lumber trade, apparently. They have a son, so I'm told, a little bit older than me and not yet married. The family are invited over after church next month to take dinner with us." "And what's this man's name?" Joel asked cautiously. Brad Devereux," she said, and set her bread down as if she had lost her appetite entirely. As for Joel, he realized he was feeling very much the same way. He knew how quickly such marriages happened in Colorado. Especially if there was some benefit in it to one or other of the parents. He tried to imagine her married to somebody else, living her life without the meadow, without her reading, without their little meetings. He knew he didn't want this to end, certainly not before it had even had a chance to begin. What if you just said no? Joel, my father has been able to bully grown men in this town, finding ways to get them to sell their businesses to him, do his bidding, always getting his own way. Do you really imagine a simple no from me will be enough? If he decides I am to marry this Brad Devereux, I'll be married to him, and that's that. My feelings certainly won't come into it. Goodness, even his favorite, Louisa, would never have had a say if she'd decided to kick up a fuss. He bullies everybody to different degrees, but the results are always the same. Not always, he said significantly. Your family are the only ones who have ever stood up to him, Joel. You must be so proud of them, and yourself, she spoke sadly. I was just a little kid like you, I hardly had anything to do with it at all. But honestly, that's not what concerns me at the moment. What concerns me is you. Well, that sure is kind of you. I just wish you'd been knocked off your horse sooner, she said and laughed, her cheeks blushing. I don't mean that there was anything good about you getting hurt, I just mean I wish I'd had this friendship for a while longer. Before it all gets taken away from me, I mean. I don't want to lose your friendship either, Rose, he said, and felt suddenly bereft already. It was true, he didn't want to lose her friendship. The truth was that he didn't want to lose the opportunity of what that friendship might turn into, what he suspected that it would so easily turn into. His feelings were coming to him quickly, he knew that, but did that really matter? If his feelings were true, then it would be better to know them now before it was all too late. Rose was a kind, sweet, gentle woman. She was intelligent and beautiful, and he knew that he had never been so fixated upon any other young lady in his life. If she was married to somebody else, he knew it would affect him greatly. And I'd like to say that we could continue to be friends, but the Devereaux live in Mayfield. That's not so far away, Joel said pointlessly. No, but it's certainly too far for me to come to the meadow, to read my book here and wait for you. I don't want you to go. Well, with any luck, Brad Devereux won't like me at all. She brightened suddenly, but he knew it was for his sake. Maybe I should dress plainly, or more plainly than I do already. Maybe I won't brush my hair that day. I reckon you could do all of that and he'd still see how beautiful you are, Joel said with such honesty that he surprised himself. He could feel himself tumbling through the air, knowing that there was nothing he could do about his growing feelings. The same way there was nothing he could do about the way his family would feel about it all. He wondered if, but for the complication of his own family, he might have already thought of some way to move them closer together. Perhaps even now he would have told her that he would never see her married to Brad Devereux. If only this wasn't so complicated. I've tried to think about it in a good light, Joel. Nobody particularly knows me in Mayfield nor my family. Certainly not well enough to despise me the way they do here. Rose. But I don't want to be in Mayfield, even if it means I do have friends at last. I want to be a part of Grafton Crest, it's my home. And I already have a friend, one I don't want to leave. When he saw the solitary tear roll down her cheek, he reached out and wiped it away with his thumb. And then he reached for her hand, and there they sat in silence for some time. He knew he would have to do something. He knew he couldn't let her go. Chapter 12. Of course, you can talk to me, Joel. And so that you know, whatever you tell me, stays with me, Tex said, as the two of them rode slowly along side by side. For 2 days, Joel hadn't been able to think of anything else but the dreadful idea of Rose marrying this Brad Devereux. When Garth had set him and Tex to head off the ranch and search for 4 missing cattle, he knew that he would end up telling him everything. I guess I've got myself into something, Tex, is something I'm not sure I can get out of. Something I'm not sure I want to get out of, Joel began. Would this have anything to do with a young lady? It does. And there's some problem with her? It's Rose Clayton. Joel realized that there was no point in slowly coming to the truth. Much better he just comes right out with it on the spot. I thought it might be, Tex said. How did you know? Joel asked and felt a little panicked. Was it that obvious? If you've guessed, then it stands to reason that. No, nobody else has guessed. It might be easier for you if they did. It'd save you the trouble of explaining it to them. Tex laughed lightly. Look, I can't imagine there's a single thing wrong with Rose Clayton. I feel sorry for the girl, I think I always have. And there's something else you need to consider in all of this, he went on. What? It's your life, Joel. It's not your sister's life, or your ma's life, or Garth's life, it's yours. I don't remember you interfering when Elsie decided to marry me, or when Jane decided to marry David. I don't reckon you'd have interfered a bit even when your ma decided to marry Garth. So, given that you haven't interfered in their lives, I reckon the least they can do is not interfere in yours, Tex spoke quite firmly. But something in your voice tells me that you expect they would anyway. Although the whole thing still seemed so impossible, he had to admit that he felt a little better for telling Tex what was on his mind. He had relieved a little of the pressure, if not all of it, but that was enough for now. I guess it's just the circumstances. The Clayton family have been something of a feature at Wild Meadow Ranch, if only in spirit. The wounds are deep, and I'm not going to lie to you and pretend that any of this is going to be easy. But just because it's not going to be easy doesn't mean you turn your back on it all. If you've got feelings for this girl, then you've got feelings. Life isn't perfect, and you don't just fall for somebody that everybody around you is going to approve of straight away. Rose hasn't done anything apart from being Dale Clayton's daughter. I guess it doesn't seem fair that she's got people all around her who won't even take the time to get to know her. And I'm not judging everybody else, for that, it sure included me up until recently. Just explain it all out to them, Joel. Tell them all about her, everything you've learned. Tell them how you feel and what you want. And if they start to object, you just ignore that. They're not going to find this easy, and it sure has nothing at all to do with Rose. It's everything that went before and everything that has nothing to do with the poor girl herself. But they still suffered a lot of hurt, you all have. I guess what I'm trying to say is go easy on them. Tell them what you want, tell them how you feel, and let them have their own feelings for a while. The only thing you can't do is let their feelings change your world, not if you really care about Rose. I reckon I really do. Well, my advice to you would be to be sure. Sound advice. The only problem is, her daddy wants to go marrying her off to some lumber merchant's son in Mayfield. He's got him going around to the house next month for dinner. And you know what Dale Clayton's like. If he decides he wants something to happen, it generally happens very quickly. Not if the Meadows family has something to say about it, Joel, you just remember that. Tex laughed and pointed off into the distance where a group of 4 cattle was standing on a patch of short grass by a rocky outcrop. There they are. Neither man quickened his pace, knowing that the cattle would simply wait there now to be collected. They'd had their fun, a little bit of freedom, but Joel reckoned they looked just about ready to be taken home again. I just wish things were better for Rose here in Grafton Crest. I wish that people hadn't just turned their backs on her all these years, not bothering to get to know her. She's such a good and kind woman, so friendly and so sweet. And maybe if the rest of the town knew it, my folks might know it too. It sure would be a good thing for her to have real friends. Well, she's got one at least. Just imagine if she could turn to Elsie or Jane and not see a look of hatred in their eyes. I don't think either of your sisters would hate her, Joel. They don't know her, that's true, and they likely think that she is no better worth getting to know than her older sister, Louisa. But maybe you can find a way to change that. A way to have the whole town see Rose for the lovely woman she is? Exactly that, Tex said and shrugged as if it was the simplest thing on earth to achieve. But how? Well, I don't know, Tex said and drew his horse up to a stop to stare at him. Oh, let's see, he went on, clearly thinking hard. You said she's kind, didn't you? She is kind, real kind. Then how about having her do 1 or 2 kind acts that will get the town thinking, huh? What sort of thing? Joel. You're going to have to put some effort into this. No wonder you wanted to get out of school every day for years. I reckon your teacher must have felt the same way. Tex was laughing heartily. He was fast becoming a good friend to Joel, despite the fact that he was so much older. But he was a good man and one who listened. Not only that, he was a man who wanted to help, and Joel certainly needed that right now. I know she must worry about the poor because she talks about community a lot. She says how her daddy doesn't care about the poor or care what he does to the community. I know that she's the complete opposite of him, so maybe something along the lines of helping less well-off families in Grafton Crest? What do you think? Joel felt suddenly optimistic. He was taking steps, moving in the right direction, and it felt good. That's the spirit, Joel, Tex said, smiling broadly. And that Reverend, he's always looking for people to help him out, isn't he? Every Sunday, talking about the folks who are less fortunate, and everybody sits there nodding sadly, and then when the time comes to offer up a bit of assistance, they stop nodding sadly and dart out of the church as fast as their legs will carry them. Why don't you get that girl of yours to approach the Rev and offer to help? If there's one person in the town guaranteed not to turn his back on anybody, it's him. That's an excellent idea, Texas excellent, Joel said in a far-off voice. Well, as much as I'd like to take credit, I reckon you more or less got there on your own. So, why don't you go and find Rose now and tell her all about it? Get moving on things, don't wait around thinking about it. But what about the 4 escapees? He said, nodding over towards the grazing cattle. Are you serious? I could get the 4 of them back home with my eyes closed, Tex said, and Joel knew that it was true. Well, if you're sure. Joel said, almost ready to heel his horse into an instant canter. Go on, go. Chapter 13. For the second day running, Rose had wandered down into town in search of Reverend Waters. He sure was a busy man, and she hadn't been able to find him anywhere the day before. She had high hopes of finding some way to help him, given that he seemed to manage so much of the care of Grafton Crest by himself. She could hardly believe she hadn't thought of it before. She was certain that it would have been most rewarding for her to have helped the people of Grafton Crest these last few years, instead of wandering aimlessly about looking for friends and things to do. Still, there was no sense thinking about what might have been. Now was the time to take action. When Joel had found her, all full of excitement, she could hardly believe it. He'd been so good to her in the meadow, drying her tears and holding her hand, but she had never thought that there was more to his feelings for her than simple kindness. Even now, she hardly dared hope that he felt for her what she had so easily come to feel for him. But was there really anything wrong with hope and faith? Why should she always avoid those two things, as if disappointment would inevitably follow hot on their heels? Perhaps it was time to enjoy things, not fear everything. It hadn't been her day to sit in the meadow, and she'd had no plans to meet him there, but he told her he had looked there for her, nonetheless. Not finding her there, Joel had continued on into town, peering into the diner to see if Rose had summoned up the courage to sit in there again alone. Not finding her there either, he had taken the riverbank path, for he knew she liked to walk along it. It was the route she often took home, for it led almost directly to the Clayton house. And that was where he had found her, at last. He'd appeared so suddenly and jumped down from his horse with such an air of excitement that she had just stared at him wide-eyed. When he told her of his idea to have her working to help the poor of Grafton Crest as a means of having people see her for who she really was, she felt excited too. The truth was, she still couldn't quite see how that might save her from having to marry Brad Devereux. Assuming she did, of course, for she had yet to meet the young man. The plan could work well in finding her a few warm friendships, it was true, but it certainly wouldn't change her father's mind when it came to marrying her off. Still, it was enough that it had stopped her moping around, and the fact that Joel had been thinking about her, coming up with something that would help her, made her feel like a brand new woman altogether. And so, she found herself once again wandering along the dusty pathway to the church. She opened the door and walked inside, closing it quietly behind her. The day before, she had encountered one of the townswomen who was arranging flowers ready for Sunday and had received a largely frosty reception. The woman would not say where the Reverend was, only that he was busy with one of his flock. To walk into the church and find it was empty was quite a relief. Today was not a day for her to be shunned by anybody. "Rose?" came a voice from behind her. The minister had opened the door so quietly that she hadn't heard him, and she turned around with a gasp. "Forgive me, I saw you making your way in and thought you might need some help," the Reverend said with a rueful grin. "Although, you probably didn't need to be frightened out of your wits, my dear." His chuckle was endearing. "No forgiveness required, Reverend Waters." "But I was looking for you, sir," she began tentatively. "Perhaps you'd like to come along into the back room and have a cup of tea?" "Oh, yes, please, that is very kind of you," she said, and followed him down the aisle, across the church, and out through a little door at the back. She'd often wondered what was behind the little door, and now she knew. It was a tiny room with a scrubbed wooden table and 2 chairs. There was a stove which was giving off a little more heat than the day required, and another small table with cups, a pan, and a jug of water. She realized then that this would be a place that Reverend Waters would bring a person in distress. Somebody who needed to talk for a while in private. Perhaps he thought that she was in distress of some kind, and she wondered if she ought to make it very clear that she was not. "I had something I wanted to ask you, Reverend. I have it in mind to do something to help some of the poorer folk here in Grafton Crest, and wondered if you might be able to give me some ideas," she began tentatively, feeling a little embarrassed. "That sounds like a wonderful idea, Rose. I must admit, despite my cajoling, I'm always short of help here. I have so many ideas and not enough time and hands to carry them out." "Then you'll let me help?" she asked brightly. "I would be very grateful for your help. I've long thought that it would be a good idea to ask local people if they have anything they could provide for those in need. Maybe a few vegetables from the farmers, some bread from their wives, good clothing from those who already have enough, that type of thing. Would you be interested in that?" "Yes, I would. I just don't know if folk would be too interested in dealing with me, particularly, she said when she realized the fatal flaw in the plan. The Reverend could go to any door and come away with at least something, but the daughter of Dale Clayton might not be so lucky. Which is why I think it's something you need to try, Rose, he said, and indicated that she should sit down. He was quiet for a few minutes as he poured some water into the pan and set it on the stove to boil. He spooned some tea leaves into an old tin teapot and then turned back to her. He was searching her face for any sign that she had understood his meaning, and she had. He'd realized that her mission was not entirely altruistic and that there was something that she had hoped to gain from it. I had been trying for a little, without much success, to find my place here in Grafton Crest. Her voice was quiet, almost a whisper, and she was surprised when her eyes filled with tears. I've sat in the diner, and I've been to the barn dance. I felt awful having to go alone, but I can't live like this any longer. And what happened when you went to the barn dance? I sat alone for a while and then Joel Meadows was kind enough to spend a few minutes with me. And at the diner? Again, I sat alone, and then Joel came in. She laughed gently. And rescued me again for a few minutes. In actual fact, it was his idea that I come here today. But please understand that I do care, Reverend Waters. I do care about people who are less fortunate than myself. I know you do, Rose. I've seen it in you since you were a child and I see it in you now. But I've also seen your suffering and have longed for some way that I could help you. It seems as if Joel Meadows' idea could be the answer to both our problems. You may be able to find a little steadier footing here in Grafton Crest, and I might finally have found a way to help you. There, we have found a way for everybody to win, haven't we? He smiled at her so kindly that the tears finally rolled down her cheeks. She hurriedly dried them with her handkerchief and knew that they were not tears of desolation. They weren't joy exactly either, but perhaps just the emotion of realizing that she hadn't truly been alone all this time. There was somebody who'd seen her struggle, a kind man who had wondered how on earth he could help. For surely, it wasn't an easy thing to help the daughter of a man who had caused so much pain and hardship in this town. So, what do you say we have a cup of tea and a nice long chat about what we're going to do next? I think that sure does sound like a fine idea, Reverend. She tucked her handkerchief away again, her tears finally dried. Let's make a plan, Rose. Chapter 14. I thought the kids were going to fall asleep face down in their plates, Elsie, Charlotte Martin said with the broad smile of a contented grandmother. Elsie had had to leave the table with her dinner only half finished to put her children to bed. They'd eaten as much as they could before their little eyes started closing where they sat, and Elsie had brightly waved away any help and darted off with a child under each arm. A quick worker, she had only been gone a matter of minutes, and her dinner was still warm when she returned. They'd had a long day, and they were so excited, Ma. And knowing that they were going to their Aunt Jane's today meant they didn't get much sleep last night. I could hear them chattering in the darkness. They take after their mother, obviously, Tex added, and everybody laughed. If you think I can talk, you should try spending the afternoon with Jane, Elsie said in her own defense. She's always got the gossip, Ma. Still, I suppose she's much nearer to it than we are. You never let that stop you finding things out, Elsie, Joel said and grinned at his sister. Well, you can't let geography get in the way, honey, Elsie retorted, smiling brightly at the younger brother she adored. What's geography? Little Kathy, now 8 years old, piped up. It's just where you are in the world, Kathy. It's all about countries and towns and all sorts of places, Joel said and ruffled his little sister's hair. So, what's the latest on the Jane Clark and Elsie Marshall grapevine then? Garth asked, reaching out for the last piece of bread when he was sure that nobody else wanted it. "Well, it looks like the Claytons are up to something again," Elsie said, covering her mouth a little as her age-old habit of speaking through food seemed not to have left her. "Oh no, what?" their mother asked, her face already dropping with concern. Joel felt his stomach tighten. Now would most certainly not be a good time for Dale Clayton to be up to his old tricks. If he was doing something underhanded in Grafton Crest, it certainly wouldn't help Rose's cause whatsoever. He braced himself for the worst. "Well, Jane said that Rose Clayton was in the diner yesterday," Elsie began. "Is she not allowed in the diner?" Tex asked, momentarily catching Joel's eye. "Of course, she is. But it's not the fact that she was in there, it's what she was doing," Elsie went on. "Well, what was she doing?" Garth asked, laying a half-eaten piece of bread down on his plate and sitting back in his chair, a sure sign that he was finished eating for the day. "Trying to get people to help her with some little job she's doing for the Reverend. Apparently, Reverend Waters has some sort of drive to go collecting bits and pieces for the poor from people who can afford it. Anyway, she seemed to be trying to drum up support for it, according to Jane. She was trying to get people to agree to go out and do some collections and then to help her deliver whatever it is to the people who need it. I must admit, honey, that's not exactly what I was expecting when you said the Claytons were up to their old tricks again," Garth said and laughed. It was a laugh that Joel could hear the relief in. It was almost worse in a way, for it meant that the family still had the capacity to be so very affected by Dale Clayton and his brood. Would he ever be able to tell them about Rose? "I know it's not really obvious what they're up to, but they're surely up to something. The Claytons most certainly don't do something out of the goodness of their hearts, do they?" Elsie said and looked from face to face around the table as if for confirmation. "Why does it have to have anything to do with the rest of the Claytons?" Joel said suddenly, hearing the snap in his own voice. "Why can't it just be a simple case of Rose Clayton deciding to do something good?" "I hardly think that likely, do you?" Elsie said and narrowed her eyes at him. "When did you become so cynical, Elsie? I know the Claytons are largely a bad lot, but what has Rose actually done to you?" "No more than Louisa's ever done to me, or Gerald, or Oscar. But they all eat out of the same trough, Joel." Elsie had never looked at him so sternly in her life. "You don't know that." "I do know that, Joel. Maybe you don't remember so well, and who can blame you, you were only little. But I remember every bit of it, and I know what they're like. Honey, the Claytons don't do something out of the kindness of their own hearts because they don't have them. They were born without hearts. I do remember every bit of it, Elsie. I remember wanting to help and not being allowed to because I was, as you say, only little. But please don't think that my experience was any the easier for it, because it wasn't. I felt terrible, as bad as anybody else did. I was a little kid who'd lost his daddy, so don't go assuming anything." He felt furious, even though he knew that he would have thought the same way as Elsie just a couple of months before. "I know you suffered, Joel. I'm sorry, honey, I didn't mean to upset you. I just don't think we can let our guard down with any of them, that's all," Elsie said in a soothing tone which made him feel instantly guilty for having barked at her in the first place. But therein lay the problem. He would always feel guilty. And that guilt, that sense of loyalty, would hold him back. "Sounds to me like we've all fixed on the wrong person here," Tex said slowly and confidently, the voice of reason, and Joel was instantly grateful. "After all, back in the days that you're all talking about, and forgive me because I know I wasn't here then, but wasn't Rose Clayton a little kid just the same as Joel here was? And if she's taken it upon herself to help the Reverend about the place, is there any harm in giving her the benefit of the doubt for a while? You just don't know what her father is like, Elsie said, not ready to let it go. I pulled you out of a burning barn, honey. I know exactly what Dale Clayton is like. What I'm saying is, I don't know Rose. I've seen enough of Louisa and Oscar and Gerald to make a pretty educated guess, but not Rose. I don't know, maybe everybody needs a break sometimes, especially if it looks as if they're trying to do good. What do you say? Reserve judgment? He gave his wife a sort of roguish grin that she seemed to like, a grin she returned. All right, I'll reserve judgment. But when I'm right, just you know that I won't stop crowing about it from morning till night, my lovely husband. When she'd finished, everybody was laughing again. Everybody but Joel, who made a pretense at it, but had to fight hard to keep himself in his seat when all he wanted to do was get out of the house. In no time at all present had settled into some conversation about the woman who ran the haberdashery in Grafton Crest, and Rose Clayton seemed to have been all but forgotten. Tex caught his eye now and again, nodding imperceptibly, the calming influence of an older, wiser man. He knew that Tex was telling him to keep his powder dry for now. He'd already made inroads. And perhaps he had, coming to the defense of Rose in a simple enough way. But he doubted very much that what he'd said would go very far at all with a family who mistrusted the Claytons entirely. And why wouldn't they? Dale Clayton had chased their father into the grave and almost taken his sister's life. He had to keep reminding himself that their grievances were genuine, heartfelt, and the result of an incredible amount of pain. But in reminding himself, he realized once again the impossibility of all of this. Whatever Tex had said about following his own path, choosing his own love, could it really be achieved in reality? He decided to let go of thinking for a while, knowing that he'd get nowhere at all as he sat at the table in the heart of the family who loved him. That very love wouldn't allow him to think straight, wouldn't allow him to make the decision that was right for him. As long as he was looking at them, he'd always make the decision that was right for them. With a sigh, he turned to his little sister, Kathy, and began to tease her, anything to take his mind off his cares. Chapter 15. The following morning, Joel didn't feel any better. Even though his family hadn't pressed him at all, he felt sure that Elsie at least suspected something. He had risen so quickly and sharply to Rose's defense that Elsie must surely have realized he knew more about her new venture with the Reverend than he'd said. He'd done very little in his first 2 hours out on the ranch, other than watch the sun make its way higher and higher in the sky. Summer was at an end, and autumn was already making itself known. Joel had done no more than ride around the perimeter of the ranch, ostensibly looking for gaps in the fencing. But he'd paid no attention to the task at all and could easily have ridden past no end of breaches without even seeing them. Although he knew he'd jumped in with both feet the night before at the dinner table, he couldn't help but remember that time was of the essence. Perhaps if Rose's new venture was quick off the ground, she might have a very good reason not to be at the Clayton family dinner table when Brad Devereux of Mayfield arrived. He didn't want her to marry that man. He didn't want her to marry anybody. Anybody who wasn't him, that was. And yet he knew that their friendship was still so new, despite the fact that he had known her for years. But surely, it was too early for him to declare that he wanted to marry her. Even if she didn't want to marry Brad Devereux, even if she wanted to stay in Grafton Crest, there was nothing to say that she would accept such a hasty proposal from him, a Meadows at that. Joel began to feel that whichever way he turned, he couldn't win. If he was true to his family, then Rose would end up living in another town with another man. If he was true to Rose, his family might never forgive him. He loved his family so much he couldn't bear the idea, but he knew that there would only be one answer in the end. Joel? Any gaps? Garth rode up, coming alongside and slowing his horse to walk beside him. Honestly, I don't know, Joel said truthfully. You've still got something on your mind, son, haven't you? I've got so much on my mind, Garth, and I wouldn't know where to begin. Was this the moment? Was this the time to start to move forward with his own life? You seemed kind of upset last night at the dinner table, Garth ventured. I was upset. You know a little something of Rose Clayton then, do you? It was a very gentle way of asking a rather blunt question. We were friends at school, you know. Not always, but in the beginning. Before. He turned to look at Garth. Before her father made my father's life a misery. I guess she wasn't much older than you at the time. She wasn't any older than me, we're the same age. I was 9, and she was 9. We were friends one day and enemies the next. That must have been very hard for you. Not as hard as it was for her. I was the one who decided we were enemies, you see. Rose has never looked at another human being and decided that they must be her enemy in all her life. I guess I just did what was easiest. I guess you just did what any other kid of your age would have done. You just cling to your family hard, and you do what you think they want. It wasn't just what I thought they wanted, though, was it? If the conversation at the table last night was anything to go by, it's what they actually did want. What they do want, he heard a little snap of bitterness. How on earth do you know that? In the same way that Elsie may have judged Rose Clayton a little harshly, don't you think you're doing the same now? Although his words were firm, Garth delivered them with kindness. Garth always spoke with kindness and acted with kindness, and Joel realized that he would have to trust him. He had to begin somewhere. I guess I didn't say all I knew last night, and maybe I should have. I know that Rose is trying to help in Grafton Crest, but I know that she wants people to see her for who she really is. But it hit me last night, they're not going to, are they? He stopped his horse altogether and turned to look at Garth. However hard she tries, the folk in this town aren't going to let her in. How do you know? Because I saw it in miniature last night. I come from the finest and most reasonable family I could possibly come from, and I sure am grateful for that. But last night all of you saw Rose Clayton's attempts to help the community as sinister, as part of a game. You've all assumed that she is exactly like her father, and she is not. But my point is, if fine people like you think that way, what chance does she stand with everybody else in this town? She might just as well marry Brad Devereux and move to Mayfield, he said, and saw Garth's eyebrows deep in confusion. You see, Dale Clayton doesn't just ride roughshod over the people of this town, he rides roughshod over his own daughters as well. Now, I'm not going to go wasting time and tears over Louisa. I never met such a gorgon in all my life, but Rose deserves better. There's nobody in town fighting in her corner, and nobody at home doing it either. If you say it, then I believe it. If you tell me she means well, then I know she means well. And you're right, the poor girl was judged at our dinner table last night, and I sure am sorry about that. But you're going to need to cut your ma and sisters a little bit of slack, however frustrating it might be. The old herd is still there, less than it used to be, further away, but still there. And while it might not be reasonable of them to throw a little guilt Rose's way, you have to appreciate that they're just humans same as you and I. I know. I know that, Garth. I can't just stand still and wait for everybody to catch up. It's not just Rose's life, it's mine. I reckon you feel something for this girl, don't you? Garth said gently, no hint of accusation in his voice. I think the world of her. And if things were different, I could have told you all about it. I could have told Ma about it and seen the thrilled look in her eyes as she tried to persuade me to bring my new girl home to meet her. And I would have given anything for that, Garth, I sure would. Little by little, son. Ordinarily, yes, but time is running out. If you think we all had a hard time standing up to Dale Clayton, imagine what it's like for Rose, a young woman on her own and his daughter to boot. So, what are you going to do about it? I'm going to start by giving her the support I should have been giving all along. I will go down into the town today to the diner. The diner? Why? Because that's where she's going to go for a third day running to see if anybody will help her on this charity drive. What's the use of me berating the whole town for turning their backs when I'm not even there supporting her? No, it's time for me to do something. Suddenly, Joel felt like a man with a purpose. He would be as kind to his family as he possibly could, as gentle as he could with their old wounds, and his own. What he wouldn't do was twist and turn his life to suit everybody else. It was time for him to live, to be a man, to make his own decisions firmly and without regret. Then off you go, son, Garth said and reached across to lay a hand on his shoulder. You've got to do what's right for you. Whatever you decide, I'll be right behind you. All I ask is that you give your ma and sisters the time they need to come to terms with it. They will, you know that as well as I do. Might take a little doing, but it'll come. I sure am proud of you for trusting yourself, and I hope that you'll be able to trust all of us too. Thanks, Garth, he said, not trusting his voice to be able to say any more. Chapter 16. So, another cup of coffee? The waitress asked in the icy tone that Rose had come to realize was reserved for her and her alone. Yes, please, that would be nice, Rose responded, finding it harder and harder to remain polite and friendly in the company of such an unpleasant young woman. I don't know why you're bothering, the waitress continued to talk to her rather loudly across the diner, even as she poured her coffee. You've been here 3 days now, and nobody is interested. So it seems, Rose said, unable to deny what was so obviously the truth. But I won't give up just yet. You never know, there might be somebody who walks in today who feels inspired to help others. You don't seem to get it, do you? There's plenty in this town who'd be tripping over themselves to help others. The waitress was scowling at her as she walked across the room with her coffee and a look which suggested that she would be pleased to throw the hot liquid all over her. Perhaps there are, but maybe not today. Rose could certainly beg to differ about the town being oh so charitable. No, that's not it either. The fact is that they don't particularly want anything to do with you. I see, Rose said, not wanting to continue the conversation when the waitress was being so openly hostile. If it had been your sister, there'd have been those who signed up to help. You know, the ones who are so afraid of your daddy that they'll try anything. They feel that way about your sister too, because they know she'll go running right up to her daddy and complain that everybody is being mean to her. But you? I don't think they'll bother, the waitress finished with something of a satisfied smile. Well, thank you for your opinion, but I think I'll keep trying anyway. Rose turned to look around the diner, silently praying for a friendly face, somebody who looked even the vaguest bit interested in joining forces with her. However, it seemed that the diners present were more interested in hearing the waitress berate her than anything else, and so she sat back down at her table with a sigh and desolately began to drink the scalding hot coffee. She'd tried, but this was getting her nowhere. It didn't matter that Reverend Waters had faith in her, that Joel had faith in her, it just wasn't helping. It didn't make any difference when the town, every one of them, wanted nothing to do with her. What a twisted view they had. They would respect Louisa for treating them with disdain, even if she made them furious. But Rose trying to behave like a decent human being seemed somehow to upset them all the more. She couldn't win. She could feel her eyes filling with tears as she looked down at the blank sheet of paper on the table in front of her. The paper upon which she had been so determined to write down the names of all those who had come forward to help. It was blank yesterday, it was blank today, it would be blank tomorrow. As far as she could see, this was the end of the road. At that moment, the door to the diner opened, and Joel walked in. For a few seconds, Rose didn't know whether to smile at him or not. The diner was not full by any stretch of the imagination, but it was not empty either. Deciding not to assume anything, Rose turned her attention back to her coffee. "What can I get you, Joel?" the waitress said, her light and appealing voice suddenly back again. "Nothing, thank you. I have only come in to see Rose," Joel said, and Rose smiled to herself when she heard the waitress sigh with disappointment. She looked up as he approached, a beaming smile on his face for all to see. Something about the way he made sure everybody saw how pleased he was to see her gave her the greatest boost of confidence she'd ever felt in her life. Not only that, but it made her fall even more deeply in love with him. "Good morning, Joel," she said a little shyly. "I hear you're looking for folks to help you out with collections and what have you for the folks that need it," he began and raised his eyebrows. "I sure am. Unfortunately, I don't have any takers yet. Looks like the town's none too interested in how the poorer folks manage," she said with some satisfaction as she noted how many of the diners squirmed a little. "Well, you can put my name on that list of yours," he said, grinning down at the blank sheet of paper which had almost brought her to tears just minutes before. "Really? Oh, Joel, that sure is kind of you," she was smiling so hard it almost hurt. "Maybe I will just have a cup of coffee while I find out a bit more," he said, calling over his shoulder to the waitress. Rose knew exactly what he was doing. Instead of looking away from her, now the other diners were showing a little interest. If one of the Meadows family had decided to get involved, did it mean that they could too? After all, Joel Meadows had lost his own daddy to Rose Clayton's evil father. If he didn't blame Rose, maybe she didn't deserve to be blamed after all. "So, tell me all about it." He was grinning at her, his handsome, bright blue eyes on hers. As she began the practiced little speech she had prepared for the rest of the town, Rose hardly dared wonder what all of this might mean for them. For her and Joel. Joel had stayed right there with her through what qualified as a midday rush in Grafton Crest. Hardly a person walked into the diner who didn't find themselves a little interested in the pair. No longer sitting in a booth as they had before, they were at a little table dead center of the diner for all to see. Joel talked loudly, smiling at Rose throughout the entire thing. By the end of the midday rush, Rose had 11 names on her list, including Joel. It was as if his very public acceptance of her had somehow given others permission to look at the young woman a little more closely. It allowed them to find out something more about the girl behind the name that everybody feared. When it looked as if she had got as many names as she was going to get that day, Joel offered to walk her back towards home along the riverbank. "That worked like magic, Joel. You know, if you hadn't come in, I would have just sat there staring down into my coffee and trying not to cry. The waitress was so mean to me before you came in that I was all set to finish my coffee and leave. But now I have this," she said, brandishing a sheet of paper full of names. "And I have you to thank for it. They trust your family every bit as much as they don't trust mine, and having you sit beside me today has made all the difference. Thank you, Joel. I just don't know how to put it any better. Maybe like this," he said and gently caught her arm, stopping her in her tracks. He turned her to face him, and she knew, without a doubt, that he was going to kiss her. This was the very moment that she had hardly dared dream about for weeks and weeks, and, now that it was here, she felt so nervous and yet so excited at the same time. He laid a hand on the side of her face, the tips of his fingers just delving into the thick brown hair of her temple. He smiled at her, looking into her eyes for the longest time before speaking. "You've got the most beautiful eyes, Rose. Do you know, they remind me of almonds? Such a pretty shape and such a pretty color. I'll tell you something else, a man could lose many an hour staring into a pair of eyes like that," he said, his voice a deep whisper as he began to lean in. When he finally kissed her, it was so wonderful that Rose almost dropped that precious piece of paper full of names. She'd never been kissed before, and she had been so certain that no man in all of Grafton Crest would ever want to. Least of all Joel Meadows. As soon as he had kissed her, he smiled again, dropping his hands to her waist and drawing her in towards him. Without another word, he began to kiss her some more, and, for her part, Rose hoped that he would never, ever stop. Chapter 17. It wasn't until the following day that gossip from the diner finally reached Wild Meadow Ranch. His mother had been down in the town that day running her own errands, and he had been certain as he went about his business on the ranch that she would come back with all the information she needed. He rode down from the top end of the ranch at the end of the day with something of a heavy feeling in the pit of his stomach. He knew that both Garth and Tex had implored him to give his ma and sisters a little time, but time was just the very thing he didn't have. He didn't want to wait and wait for them to discover that Rose Clayton was a wonderful woman. He didn't want his care of them to see her married to somebody else and taken away from him. Nonetheless, he didn't particularly look forward to that evening's dinner, even less so when he walked into the kitchen to discover that Tex and Elsie's children had already been put to bed. That could mean only one thing: the family at large had something they wanted to say to him. Well, if they had something to say, they would have to bring it up. Joel smiled in his usual way before going through to his own room to wash up, ready for dinner. He took his time, leaving the door to his room slightly ajar in case he heard any discussion at all drifting in from the kitchen. All he heard, however, was a very familiar scene: plates and cutlery clanking as everything was set out, the squeak of the stove door as his mother opened it to retrieve whatever tasty stew was bubbling away inside. Nothing about him, nothing to suggest that they knew anything at all. But they did, he knew they did. By the time he made his way out into the kitchen once again, the table was set, and the steaming hot pan of stew was perched on a heavy cloth in the center. As soon as he appeared, his mother began to ladle the stew out into all their bowls. "That sure does smell good, Ma," Joel said, feeling suddenly awkward and wishing that he didn't have this particular mountain to climb. Why couldn't it have just been simple? A young man falling in love with a beautiful young woman without any family complications on either side. "Sit yourself down, honey," his mother said in such an ordinary voice that he began to wonder if he'd been mistaken. Perhaps nobody had bothered to make it their business to let Charlotte Martin know how her only son had betrayed her in front of the whole town. And that's exactly how he felt at that moment, as if he'd betrayed her and everybody else. But if he turned away from Rose, he would have betrayed himself. There wasn't an option for him to be right. To be able to please everybody. It just didn't exist. He settled down at the table and took his first mouthful of stew. It probably was as wonderful as always, but it felt like dust in his mouth as he waited for somebody to say something about Rose Clayton. He didn't have long to wait. "I was down in the town today, Joel," his mother began, and he set his spoon down into his bowl and sat back in his chair, braced for whatever was coming. "Oh. Yes, I saw Eileen Thornton. Eileen Brown, I should say," she chuckled as she always did when she referred to her eldest daughter's friend by her maiden name. "I hope she's well," Joel said, feeling that this was all a little ridiculous. His mother had a point, and he wished that she would just get to it. She was telling me about the diner yesterday, she began tentatively. Oh, yes? She said you were there, she went on. Amazing really, I didn't set eyes on Eileen once. Still, this is Grafton Crest and news travels fast, doesn't it? Or should I say gossip? He could already feel his hackles rising and stoically ignored the warning glances from Tex across the table. Now, you know there's no harm in Eileen. She gossips, right enough, but then so do I. So does Elsie. She turned to look at her daughter, who nodded her admission of guilt. I sure do, Elsie said in a voice which sounded vaguely amused. Nonetheless, Joel was on the defensive, and he didn't have time to wonder why it was that Elsie sounded so light-hearted. He just wanted to get this over and done with. Well, if Eileen has told you all about it, then you must know that I signed up to help Rose with her charity drive. He looked all around the table at the faces of his family, each one expectant, waiting to hear more. And you might just as well know that I actually like Rose. She's a nice woman, a kind woman, and I'm just about sick and tired of the way this town treats her just because her last name is Clayton. Now, I know I wasn't much better than anybody else myself, but at least I've learned by my mistakes, he went on, even though Tex was gently shaking his head from side to side, his eyes as round as saucers. I'm not going to go back over all the things I felt when Daddy died, you've heard it already. We've had this conversation, and I sure don't want to have it again. So, I will just tell you this once, right? Rose Clayton was a child when my daddy died. She had no more to do with putting him in his grave than I did. Now, I don't want to go offending anybody at his table, Lord knows I love you all, but I have my own life to lead, and I have my own sense of what's right and what's wrong. And let me tell you, the way this town has treated Rose is wrong. Not only did she have no power over what happened to my daddy, but she had no knowledge of what her daddy was planning when Elsie was stuck in that burning barn. She has no control over the man who wants to buy out all of Grafton Crest and make himself the king of it. Not only does she have no control over it, she knows what he is, and she can't bear it. All she wants is to be a part of things, to be accepted for who she is. Not for who her father is, not for who her brothers are, and most certainly not for who her sister is. Just herself. Just Rose Clayton. And if none of you sitting here at this table can give that woman a chance, then that's your business. But I'm telling you now that I have given her a chance, and that's my business. She's alone in the world, completely alone, not just in the town, but at home too. She's alone, and she's innocent, and the way that she is treated just isn't right. And I'll tell you something now, I know my daddy wouldn't have stood by and let that happen, and neither will I. Neither will I, he said, not really knowing how to finish his rant. He picked up his spoon uselessly, knowing that his appetite had deserted him completely. He stuck it into the bowl and began to swirl the meat and gravy around and around, just as he used to when he was a child and was in trouble for something. You're so much like your daddy, Joel. Not just to look at, but in your heart. You're a good man, and I always knew that you would be. If you have one tiny failing, it's this, jumping in with both feet. Honey, I was about to tell you that what you did yesterday in the diner for that young woman made me so proud of you. Even as Eileen was describing you, I recognized my boy right there. And I don't mind telling you, I cried a tear or two of pride on the way home. So, let that teach you something about leaping to conclusions, son, she said, and rose from her seat and walked around the table, bending forward to kiss the top of his blonde head. I really am so proud of you, honey. Oh. He looked helplessly at Tex, who shrugged in a way which suggested he'd tried to help him. Joel realized then that the family had, at some point, sat down and discussed it. He had no doubt whatsoever that Tex and Garth had already gone some way to easing the path even before Joel had taken the step of joining Rose in the diner for all to see. "And I'm sorry, Joel," Elsie said, leaning sideways to put her arm around his shoulders. "I really was being cynical the last time we talked about Rose, and I shouldn't have been. I reckon I was right there with the rest of the town not giving her a chance to be herself, and I sure am sorry for it. I hope you can forgive me," she said, and turned to look at him, making such doe eyes that Joel began to laugh. "Of course, I can forgive you. Maybe you will forgive me too for that rant," he said, and felt uncomfortably emotional. "For what, for that? It's the most we've heard you speak in a long while." "I think I like her a little more for putting such passion in your heart," Charlotte said, shaking her head as if to already deny he had anything for which forgiveness was required. "I should have trusted you all from the beginning. I should have known that you would sort through it yourselves and find your way to what was right. Well, now that that's all done, does anyone mind if I tuck into this stew before it goes cold? I'm a hard-working man, and a hard-working man has got to eat," Garth said humorously, breaking the spell and returning them all to their customary ease and flow. Nobody minded, and soon the clank of cutlery and the normal, good-natured talk filled the room. Chapter 18. Rose's first day of helping Reverend Waters with the charity drive had been an exhausting one. She hadn't minded fetching and carrying at all. In fact, she'd found it gave her something of a healthy glow. But she had been working with some of the people who had signed up to help her, and the stress of getting to know them had taken its toll. They were all nice and, if she was honest, had all been a little curious. It was almost like enemies at the cessation of hostilities in a war, finally meeting after years of wondering what the other was like. It had been wonderful and nerve-wracking all at once, and it had exhausted her, even as she looked forward to the next day and the day after. Finally, it seemed as if she was to have a place in Grafton Crest, one that she had carved out for herself with a little help from Reverend Waters and a lot of help from Joel Meadows. She wondered what good that would do her if her father was determined to have her marry the young man who was due to sit at the dining table at the end of that week. But perhaps things would be different now. Perhaps Joel's kiss meant that he felt for her what she felt for him. She supposed only time would tell, and she couldn't wait to see him again. They were due to meet the following afternoon in the meadow, assuming that she had finished her morning's work with the Reverend by then. She wondered how they would be now when they first set eyes on one another again after each of them had had 2 long nights in which to think about the kiss. She could smell dinner cooking and had assumed that, as was normal in the middle of the week, she would just be sitting down to eat with her father and Gerald. She and Gerald were the only two who still lived under their father's roof, and so when she walked into the dining room to see the entire family there, she was taken aback. She noted that neither Louisa nor her brother, Oscar, had brought their children with them and found herself relieved. All the children were precious, but her nieces and nephews were so poorly raised and so dreadfully behaved that they would have tired her even more than she was already. With that thought out of the way, she began to wonder what on earth they were all doing there on a Friday evening. "What," she began. "We thought you'd never come home, Rose," Louisa said, and gave her a sickly sweet smile. It was a smile Rose had seen more times than she could count when they were growing up, and she knew exactly what it meant. Louisa had found some reason to run to their father and tell a tale, and it gave her a nasty pleasure, as it always had done. Well, what did it matter if she'd run to tell their father about Rose's charitable work? Rose had already told him herself, despite the fact that he had rolled his eyes and mocked her for it. If Louisa thought she had so much worth saying, she was going to be disappointed. "Yes, I've had a long day with Reverend Waters and some of the ladies from the town who've been helping collect all sorts of things for the poor," Rose said with a smile, glad to take the wind out of her sister's sails. And then we'll be delivering everything we gathered tomorrow. You'll be doing no such thing, her father said in a low, frightening tone. Rose looked from her father to Louisa, seeing Louisa's barely contained glee. Whatever it was, Rose was in serious trouble. "Daddy," she said, her hands already trembling. "I can hardly believe that a daughter of mine could turn out to betray me like this. You've been given everything, Rose, and yet you've seen fit to mock me," he went on, almost enjoying his own anger. "I don't know what you—" "Oh, yes, you do. You were seen, Rose. One of my friends was down on the riverbank with her babies when she saw you. Obviously, she came directly to me to let me know just how far you've fallen." Despite her words, Louisa couldn't stop smiling. Did she really hate her sister this much? They had been raised in such a peculiar manner that perhaps Louisa hated everybody, even herself. "Oh, no," Rose said, realizing what great trouble she was in. This friend, this person who had tripped over her own skirts to get to Louisa with the fresh gossip, could only have seen her kissing Joel. "With one of the Meadows, how could you?" Her father spoke again, confirming her worst fears. "You know what they have done to this family over the years, and yet you lower yourself to consort with one of them? There must be some mistake, Rose." He looked at her, daring her to try to get out of it. "There's no mistake, Daddy. And as for what the Meadows have done to us, I cannot see it. What about everything this family has done to theirs? What you have done to them, Daddy? It is no wonder that half the town shunned me. They shun you because you're boring and plain, honey. They don't shun me, do they? And why?" "Well, just look at the difference between the two of us," Louisa said, never missing an opportunity to puff herself up. "They do shun you, Louisa. They might talk to you, they might flatter you, but don't fool yourself that they like you. They despise you, and you're too stupid to see it. You prance around the town with your head held high and your ringlets swinging this way and that, and you genuinely think that everybody is impressed. You parade about on the arm of a husband you don't love, and you're furious with me now, absolutely furious. I can see it in your eyes. You're not furious because you think I've betrayed the family. You're furious because you know that of the two of us, I am the only one who has found true love," Rose said, hardly able to recognize the voice of the angry young woman who was speaking. Could it really be her? Could she really be telling her family exactly what she thought of them? "Why, you little prairie dog," Louisa said, screeching like a cat and flying across the room to sink her nails into her younger sister's face. In the end, it was Louisa's husband who pulled his wife away and pushed her unceremoniously back down into her chair. Her father and her brothers had simply sat there, content to watch one sister trying to destroy the other. What a vile bunch they were. Rose raised a hand to her face, feeling the raised scratches and the wetness where her sister's nails had drawn blood. She looked at her father, wondering if he would now stand up for her. But what was she thinking? Of course, he wouldn't. "You will go to your room, and you will stay there," her father began. "And on Sunday, when the Devereux family get here, you will behave yourself. You will smile and laugh and do everything in your power to appeal to Brad. I will not have you running around town with the scum of the earth, do you hear me? You will forget all about the Meadows boy, and you will concentrate every one of your efforts on securing a good and decent union with Brad Devereux. And as for your Reverend Waters, he will have to manage without you. You are confined to this house until I say otherwise. Now get out of my sight." Rose couldn't think straight. She knew that she would never be able to marry Brad Devereux, she just didn't know how she was going to get out of it. With her family glaring at her as if she were the most shameful creature on the earth, Rose finally turned and made her own way to her room. Chapter 19. Joel woke up somewhat groggy, given that he had hardly slept. The emotions of the evening before had exhausted him, but still he hadn't been able to sleep for his excitement as he thought of everything the future might now hold. He was certain that Rose felt the same way about him as he felt about her. He'd seen it in her eyes. So much had happened in his world in the last day or so that he could hardly believe he hadn't set eyes on her since he'd kissed her on the riverbank. Still, they had planned to meet in the meadow as usual, only a little later in the afternoon so that she could continue her work with Reverend Waters. "Pick your feet up, honey, or you will end up nose down on the floor," his mother said, as she did most days. Joel still had his boyhood habit of sliding exhaustedly into the kitchen before the sun was even up, not bothering to lift his feet as he went. Through bleary eyes and a haze of fatigue, he grinned at his mother. Without a word, he took his seat at the kitchen table opposite Elsie. Elsie smiled at him brightly but didn't say anything. She was always bright and cheerful in the morning, although her head always seemed to be somewhere else altogether. She was an unusual sort of a sister, but he loved her more than ever now. "I'll feed you two first, as always. I've no doubt that Garth and Tex will wander out somewhere in the next half an hour," Charlotte said, knowing the habits of every family member by heart. "Thanks, Ma," Joel began but was cut off by a gentle tapping at the kitchen door. "It's a bit early for one of the ranch hands," Elsie said quizzically as she got to her feet and hurried towards the door. Joel looked over his shoulder as Elsie opened it to see who was standing there and was entirely surprised to see Rose in the doorway shivering. Her face was scratched and paler than ever, the scratches standing out horribly. He was on his feet in a second, racing towards the door. Elsie was already pulling Rose inside, holding on to her by her upper arm to steady her. "Goodness, you are so cold." "It must be autumn already," Elsie said, turning to look at her mother for help. "Come in, Rose," Charlotte was already leading her into the room. "You're so cold, poor girl." She turned to look at Joel. "She's been out all night, no doubt about it," she finished in a whisper, even though it was quite clear Rose could hear her. "Sit her down at the table, Joel, and I'll get a fire started." Elsie looked at him wide-eyed before searching the wooden dresser for a match to put to the kindling that was already set in the grate. "Rose, what is it? What happened?" Joel kneeled in front of her, holding her hand in his. "Who did that to your face?" "Louisa. My sister," she said and looked down as if ashamed. Joel realized that she wasn't very far from tears and wanted to spare her that much in front of his family. "Ma, how about some coffee?" he said, even though he could see that his mother was already peering down into the pan she had set to boil some minutes before. Of course, Charlotte said. "Don't you worry, honey, we'll have you warmed up in no time." "If she's been out there all night, Ma, she's going to need something hot to eat," Elsie added, and Joel felt suddenly so proud of his family. He really ought to have trusted them in the first place, and he knew it. "What happened? Why did Louisa scratch your face and why didn't your daddy put a stop to it?" he asked, gently trying to coax the information out of her. None of them stopped her. "Well, actually her husband did in the end, but only because he doesn't like alley-cat behavior in his wife," she gave a bitter laugh. "They know about us, Joel. They were all there waiting for me when I got home yesterday from the church. One of Louisa's hateful friends gave us away." She didn't need to say any more. Joel realized that they must have been seen down by the riverbank. He could have kicked himself for his lack of awareness. He should have made absolutely certain that there was nobody else down there by the river. This was his fault, and he knew it. I'm so sorry, he said, trying to apologize for his foolhardiness without saying a word about it. He didn't want her to have to suffer the idea of his mother and sister hearing all about their few minutes of intimacy, for it was theirs and theirs alone. It's not your fault. It's not my fault, either. My family is so hateful, so without feeling. My father banished me to my room and told me I couldn't come out until he says so. He is more determined than ever now that I marry into the Devereux family, and he threatened me that if I don't behave on Sunday, I'll be sorry for it. But how did you get out? Did he have a change of heart? Elsie asked, finally creeping back across the kitchen to take a seat next to Rose and lay a reassuring hand on the younger woman's shoulder. No, he didn't. I knew I couldn't stay there any longer. They never had much care for me. I'm not bold and showy like Louisa, but this is the first time they've actively despised me. My life wasn't much there before, but it would be impossible now. All my father can see is that I have betrayed him, even though I've done nothing of the sort. My only crime is falling in love with a kind and wonderful man, but he'll never see that. He'll never forget it, and he'll never forgive me, and I'm furious with him for thinking that I need his forgiveness in the first place. I'm sorry for coming here at such an hour, for just turning up, but I'm so cold. Her voice was surprisingly steady, and Joel couldn't possibly have been more impressed with her than he was in that moment. She was so brave, walking away with nothing rather than be treated so shamefully by her own family. Honey, there isn't a single thing you can do about your family. None of us have a choice where we land in this world. It all comes down to luck in the end, Charlotte said gently as she set the steaming hot cup of coffee down in front of their unexpected guest. To have stayed as long as you have, I reckon it's true to say that you've done as much as you can. But first things first, you need a hearty breakfast inside you and a good long rest before you can figure out what to do next. Elsie rose again, crossing the kitchen to help her mother get breakfast started. There was a flurry of pans clanging and bacon sizzling as Joel stayed exactly where he was, kneeling in front of Rose and holding tightly to her hands. There isn't anything to figure out, Joel, Rose said in a whisper. There isn't anywhere for me to go. I don't have any other family, any other friends. I don't have anybody to turn to. I know I couldn't have stayed there, but I don't know what I'm going to do next, she said and suddenly seemed afraid. You do have somebody to turn to, Rose. You have me, and you'll always have me. I know it's kind of soon, I know we haven't really known each other for too long, but I know how I feel. And I've known these last weeks that I sure didn't want you to marry Brad, whatever the heck his name is, he said, pleased to draw a small laugh from her. I've known from the moment you mentioned it that it would just about be the end of me if you were gone, if you were with somebody else. I hope I'm not frightening you, talking like this, but if the last few days have taught me anything, it's that the truth needs to be said, whatever it is. He could feel his mouth going a little dry with nerves. And the truth is, Rose, that I love you. I mean, I really love you, more than I had ever imagined loving anybody. Oh, Joel, I love you too, she said as tears finally rolled down her scratched cheeks. Without your love, I don't think I would have survived. I would have faded away. Your love saved me, thank you so much. You saved me too, he said. I had no purpose in life, and that is a real hard thing, a thing that drags you down. With you, life is full of purpose. I want to ask you something. I know it's too soon, but I have to ask. He waited for a moment, and her beautiful eyes opened wider, and she nodded. Rose, do you trust me enough to marry me? Because I sure do want you for my wife, he said, hardly daring to look across the room to where his mother and sister stood open-mouthed. Of course, I trust you, Joel. There's nobody in this world more important to me than you. Who else would I trust? Finally, she leaned forward and flung her arms around his neck, holding on to him tightly. "Good morning," Garth said, wandering into the kitchen. "Have I missed something?" he asked in a confused voice as Charlotte and Elsie let out a shout of joy and congratulations. Epilogue. "Oh, there you are, Rose," Elsie said as she trudged across the weed-strewn farmland. "Am I interrupting?" "It's just that I have something really important to tell you." "No, not at all. Come down to the house, Elsie, and let me make you a drink." Rose trudged through the weeds and reached out to take her sister-in-law's hand. They walked back to the little farmhouse, chattering all the way. "So, what's so important?" Rose asked and grinned. She liked Elsie very much. "I've heard that Ned Jeffries has an almost brand new plow for sale. Goodness knows what he ever needed a plow for. He's a rancher, not a farmer, but I reckon it's in good condition and going cheap." "Oh, that's good news," Rose said when they finally made their way into the small kitchen. "Sit yourself down, and I'll set some water to boil." Elsie settled down at the kitchen table, leaning back heavily in her chair as she always did. She looked around the kitchen with an appraising eye, smiling all the while. "You sure have made a good job of this place. It's so homely. Really, nobody would ever have believed it's been empty all these years." "Thank you, I've enjoyed every minute of it. It felt like home the very first day I set foot inside." Rose and Joel had been married very quickly. Not only did Charlotte and Garth Martin suggest speedy nuptials to satisfy Reverend Waters, but also to keep Dale Clayton at bay. They knew better than anybody what a vindictive man he was, and they were certain that Rose would not be safe until she was legally married and absolutely out of her father's control. Everything had happened so quickly that she could hardly believe it even now, and the women of Wild Meadow Ranch had taken her to their hearts so quickly that she had been truly amazed. Jane and Elsie had worked tirelessly to make her the most beautiful little dress for her wedding, and Charlotte had baked for 2 days straight so that they had enough food to offer whomever came up from Grafton Crest to help them celebrate. And, in the end, a surprising number had joined them, really smiling at her for the first time and wishing her well. When she thought that her day could not have been any better, Garth had surprised both her and Joel in a way that neither of them would ever forget. He had handed them the deeds to the farmhouse he'd once shared with his first wife. The farmhouse he'd left almost a decade earlier when he had married Charlotte. The farm itself was a tangle of weeds, useless land which needed a great amount of work to have it up and running. The house, of course, was well built and certainly large enough to raise a little family when the time came. It had been well kept in the years before Garth had left, but had stood empty for so long that there was inevitably a fair amount to do to make it homely once more. In the 3 months since they'd been married, Rose had certainly thrown herself into turning it into a fine home for them both. "I'm still so surprised you're here. Do you know, I never had any idea at all that Joel wasn't quite suited to the ranch. He always laughed at me, you know, because I miss so much that other people spot immediately. I mean, Garth knew it, and my ma knew it. Even Tex could see it. Still, I am as I am," Elsie grinned. "Well, I wouldn't change you. I sure am pleased to have you for a sister," she said truthfully, remembering how awful her own true sister was. "I'm just sorry that we weren't friends sooner. I know that's my fault, honey, and not yours." Elsie was every bit as open and honest as Joel, the family resemblance never more obvious than in the moments when they spoke from the heart. It had been a revelation to Rose to be a part of a family who actually cared. They asked her about her day, about her work that she continued to do with Reverend Waters, about the farm, about her latest sewing project. They were interested in her, truly interested. Apart from seeing her sister in Grafton Crest some weeks previous, Rose had had no contact whatsoever with her family. Her father had cut her off entirely, and Louisa had proudly told her that he was declaring to anybody who would listen that he now only had one daughter, not two. She had expected such news to affect her far more than it really did. In fact, if she hadn't found herself in the heart of such a caring family, Rose would probably have been devastated to hear such cruel words and to be entirely disowned by her own flesh and blood. But nothing could be further from the truth. To be free of them at last, to know that she would never have to sit down at the dining table again on a Sunday afternoon with the entire family present, produced the most wonderful and sweeping sense of relief. That relief had caused a little guilt for a while, just enough that she'd confided in Reverend Waters about it. He'd put her mind at rest immediately, telling her that God already knew she had done everything she could as far as her own family was concerned. The rest was up to them now, for the rift between them had been entirely their doing. Don't you ever go feeling bad about anything, Elsie. We're here now, and we're friends, and that's all that matters. I have a real family at last, and I'll only ever be grateful for that. You'll never hear any recriminations from me, and that's the truth. Elsie grinned at her again, getting to her feet and throwing her arms around her. She was an unusual woman, silent one moment and effusive the next, but Joel told her that she would soon get used to having a sister like Elsie. "Ladies," Joel said when he strode into the kitchen from outside. "Do you want a new plow?" Elsie asked seriously, still holding tightly to Rose. "Nothing changes, Elsie. You're still the strangest sister in the whole world," Joel said and laughed. He settled himself down at the kitchen table with his sister while Rose finished making them all some coffee. She shyly carved up an apple pie she'd made the day before, wondering if it would pass muster. She had never cooked anything in her life before becoming a married woman and was enjoying every minute of it, albeit she was a little nervous every time somebody tried one of her offerings. She needn't have worried, for both Joel and Elsie praised the apple pie to the heavens, and each asked for another slice. By the time Elsie left, promising to return with Garth and Tex the next day to help Joel collect the new plow from Ned's place, Rose felt a wonderful and warm sense of pure contentment. "You'll get used to her, like I said," Joel said as they waved Elsie off. "I'm already used to her, and I love her," Rose said truthfully. "Your whole family are so wonderful." "Our family. Yours now as well as mine, don't forget." He turned to take her into his arms as they stood on the porch in the cold winter air. "I wonder how long it will take us to get the farm up and running," she said wistfully as she peered across acres and acres of rough land. "I don't mind how long it takes. It's the challenge I need," he said, his breath spiraling away from him in warm plumes. "And you really don't miss the ranch?" "I haven't had a chance to miss it. If we're not there having dinner, they're wandering over here with news of plows for sale. Really, can you think of a single day in which we haven't seen some or all of the family?" He was chuckling. "No, I can't," she said thoughtfully. "And I hope it's always this way. I never imagined having a life like this. It's so busy and so full of people and things to do. Just a year ago, I would never have believed I'd be standing here on this porch with you. My life's so full of wonderful things that it's almost bursting at the seams. I guess we were both a little lost back then." "I know I was," he gently kissed her. "But we found each other, didn't we? Just as we were always meant to." "Yes, my love, just as we were always meant to." Thank you for listening to this Indiana Wake audiobook. If you enjoyed the story, don't forget to subscribe to Indiana Wake and Friends so you never miss future free audiobooks and new adventures.